Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I worked nights maintaining soccer fields for a sports complex outside Bakersfield for almost a year. The place had 12 full-size fields spread across flat open ground with chain link fencing and maintenance sheds between them. During the day, it stayed packed with kids, tournaments, food trucks, all that noise. But after midnight, it turned into this huge, empty stretch of wet grass and sprinklers. Most nights I worked alone. This happened in early September during a heat wave. Even after dark, the air stayed warm and dry, except around the irrigation lines where everything smelled damp and earthy. I usually started watering around 11 p.m. once the last security patrol left. That night, the sky had this weird, low haze over it. No stars visible, just dull, gray clouds reflecting city light from miles away. I remember because the fields looked brighter than normal without actually being lit. Around 12:30, I was driving one of the maintenance carts between fields 8 and 9, checking sprinkler heads. A few had been sticking lately, spraying sideways instead of rotating properly. Everything felt normal at first. Water spraying in slow arcs, grass shining under the floodlights near the parking lots, crickets everywhere. Then the sprinklers near field 11 stopped moving. Not all of them, just 3 in a line along the north edge. The water still sprayed, but the heads froze, pointed toward the same spot in the grass. I noticed because the streams crossed each other strangely and started flooding one patch. I figured pressure dropped somewhere in the system. I parked the cart and walked over. The closer I got, the quieter things seemed. Not completely silent, just muted somehow. The crickets faded first. Then I realized I couldn't hear traffic from the highway anymore either, only the hiss of water. The grass near the frozen sprinklers looked brighter than the rest of the field. At first, I thought maybe one of the nearby floodlights had switched on behind me, but when I turned around, nothing had changed. The glow came from the grass itself, not bright, soft, pale white, barely stronger than moonlight. Except there was no moon. The glowing patch stretched maybe 15 feet across near midfield. The light stayed low to the ground, almost trapped inside the grass instead of shining outward. I stopped walking immediately. The sprinkler water passed through the glow and looked strange inside it somehow. Slower, maybe. Thicker. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it didn't look like normal water anymore. I remember checking above the field, expecting helicopter lights or maybe somebody with a drone nearby. Nothing overhead. The clouds looked solid and low. The sprinklers continued spraying toward the glowing area without rotating. I approached closer. The wet grass smelled odd. Not fertilizer. Not electrical exactly either. More like hot dust after rain. The glow didn't brighten when I got near it. It just stayed steady. Then one of the frozen sprinkler heads twitched sharply. Not resumed rotating, just jerked once toward the glowing patch. I jumped hard enough that water splashed across my boots. The sprinkler stopped again immediately afterward. I crouched near the edge of the glow, trying to figure out what I was actually seeing. The grass inside it looked normal, except the blades reflected light strangely, almost metallic around the edges. I reached one hand toward it. The air above the glowing patch felt warmer than the rest of the field. Not by much, but noticeable. Then I heard a sound behind me, footsteps. I spun around expecting security. Nobody there. The empty field stretched dark behind me with sprinklers turning slowly in the distance. But the footsteps continued, soft, wet, circling somewhere nearby. I stood perfectly still listening. The sound moved through the grass to my left now, then stopped. The sprinklers nearest the glow suddenly shut off all at once. Not the entire irrigation system, just those 3 heads. Water dribbled from them weakly before stopping completely. The field became very quiet. That's when the glow brightened slightly. Not enough to light the whole area, just enough that I could see movement inside it. At first I thought it was heat distortion. Then I realized something beneath the grass was shifting slowly, not pushing upward, moving underneath. The ground remained flat, but shadows passed through the glowing patch from one side to the other. Long shapes, too smooth to be animals digging. I backed away immediately. My radio crackled at my belt, suddenly loud enough to make me flinch. Static blasted through the speaker for maybe 3 seconds. Then I heard part of a voice. Not clear words, just somebody talking fast and far away. I grabbed the radio. Carlos? No response. More static. Then silence again. The glow dimmed slightly while I stood there holding the radio. I remember becoming very aware of how alone I was. The maintenance building sat across several dark fields maybe a quarter-mile away. The parking lots beyond them were empty by then. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Not unusual sometimes around the far fields, but still unsettling. The glow shifted sideways suddenly. Not the light itself. The illuminated section moved several feet across the grass smoothly like a spotlight sweeping over the field. Except there was still no visible source. The movement stopped near one of the sprinkler heads. Then the metal sprinkler began vibrating softly. I could hear it rattling against the pipe underground. A low hum started beneath my feet at almost the same moment. Very faint. More felt than heard. The grass around the glowing patch flattened slightly. Not pressed down by wind, just bent inward toward the center. My chest tightened immediately because every instinct I had suddenly screamed to leave. Instead, I stood there staring. The hum grew stronger. Then I noticed something near the far side of the field. A person. At least I thought it was. Tall shape standing near the fence line. Too dark and distant to make out details. I shouted automatically, "Hey!" No response. The figure didn't move. I actually felt relieved for a second because at least another human being was nearby. Then the glow on the grass dimmed again and the figure disappeared completely. Not walked away. Gone. I blinked several times trying to relocate it against the fence. Nothing there now except darkness. The hum stopped instantly afterward. At the same moment, every sprinkler on the surrounding fields resumed rotating normally. Water swept across the grass again in steady clicking arcs. Crickets returned too. All at once. The sudden noise almost made me dizzy, but the glowing patch remained. Softer now, fading slowly. I finally decided to call somebody. I drove the maintenance cart back toward the sheds fast enough that the tires slid on wet pavement. The whole way there, I kept checking behind me, expecting headlights or another worker. Nobody. Inside the maintenance building, I found another groundskeeper named Eric taking inventory. I told him one of the irrigation zones was malfunctioning and maybe shorting out electrically. I didn't mention the glow at first because it sounded insane, even in my own head. Eric grabbed a flashlight and followed me back out. By the time we reached Field 11, maybe 6 or 7 minutes later, the glow was gone completely. The grass looked normal. All sprinklers rotated correctly. Eric checked the control box while I stood there trying not to sound crazy. Then he frowned and asked why the ground felt warm. I looked at him immediately. He crouched and touched the grass near midfield. "Feel this." I knelt beside him. The grass was definitely warmer there. Not hot, just oddly warm compared to the cold irrigation water soaking everything else. Eric opened the control box nearby and said something stranger then. The irrigation timer for those 3 sprinkler heads had shut off for exactly 11 minutes. The system logs showed it clearly, but the timer itself never recorded a fault or pressure issue. We walked the field with flashlights another 15 minutes, finding nothing else unusual. Eventually Eric left. I stayed behind finishing the watering schedule, because dawn crews arrived in a few hours. Around 3 a.m. I drove past Field 11 again. The grass looked normal at first. Then my headlights swept across midfield. For maybe 1 second, something reflected back from the ground. Not water, not metal. A pale white shimmer low in the grass, gone immediately when the cart moved past. I stopped and looked back. Nothing there. But all 3 sprinklers nearest that spot had stopped rotating again, and this time they remained pointed directly toward me. I used to spend a lot of weekends driving around photographing abandoned places. Mostly old gas stations, motels, closed factories, stuff like that. Nothing illegal usually, just empty places slowly falling apart. A friend told me about an abandoned drive-in theater outside Amarillo that had been shut down since the late 90s. The giant movie screen was supposedly still standing out in the middle of a huge empty lot. I drove out there one evening in late August. Hot day, but after sunset the temperature dropped fast. dry wind across open fields. The sky stayed mostly clear except for low clouds moving in from the west. The drive-in sat several miles off the highway down an old farm road surrounded by flat land and telephone poles. When I got there around 10 p.m., the place looked enormous in the dark. The cracked parking area stretched forever beneath weeds growing through the pavement. The old concession building sat near the entrance with busted windows and faded posters still hanging inside. And way out near the center stood the screen, huge white rectangle towering above the empty lot. I parked near the front gate and grabbed my camera gear. At first, everything felt normal. Wind pushed dry weeds across the pavement. Metal speaker posts creaked occasionally. The whole place had that abandoned quiet where every little sound carries farther than it should. I took photos for probably half an hour without anything unusual happening. Mostly long exposures of the screen and an old ticket booth. The moonlight reflected faintly off the cracked asphalt. Then I noticed the glow. At first, I thought headlights approached from another road nearby, a pale circular light appearing near the base of the giant screen. But there weren't any roads back there, and the glow stayed completely still. Soft white, not especially bright, just strange. The weirdest part was the way it illuminated the ground. The dirt and broken pavement beneath it glowed clearly, but the surrounding weeds and metal poles stayed dark, like the light stopped inches above the ground instead of spreading outward normally. I lowered the camera and stared at it for a while, trying to figure out what caused it. No sound came from that part of the lot. No vehicle engine. Nothing. Then came the humming. Low. Barely audible beneath the wind. Whum. I felt it more through my chest than through my ears. Several seconds later again. Whum. The glow brightened slightly during each pulse. I remember checking around instinctively, expecting another photographer or maybe trespassers messing with lights. Nobody else was there. The entire drive-in looked empty, except for the pale glow near the screen. Whum! The vibration deepened. The metal camera tripod in my hand trembled faintly during the pulse, and the wind around the lot began fading. Not stopping completely, just sounding farther away. I started walking slowly toward the screen. The glow remained fixed near the center of the lot beneath it. Perfect circle, maybe 10 feet across, still only illuminating the pavement directly underneath. The giant movie screen towered above it, black against the clouds. I remember noticing then that the insects around the drive-in had gone quiet too. No crickets, no buzzing, nothing except the low humming. Whum! The pulse came stronger this time. The pressure inside my ears shifted painfully for a second, and the glow brightened enough that I could see faint fog or dust swirling above it despite the dry air. I stopped walking about 50 yards from the screen. Something about the glow felt wrong up close. Not dangerous exactly, just unnatural, like my eyes couldn't fully focus on it. The edges stayed blurry no matter how hard I stared. Whum! The vibrations spread through the pavement beneath my boots during the pulse. I raised the camera and snapped several photos toward the glow. The shutter lagged strangely, slow enough that I checked settings thinking I'd bumped something accidentally. The humming deepened again. Whum! And suddenly the giant movie screen reflected pale white across its entire surface. Not brightly, just enough that the old peeling paint became visible in the darkness. Then all the normal sounds disappeared. No wind, no insects, nothing. The silence hit hard enough that I froze immediately. The glow beneath the screen remained perfectly still, and for the first time I noticed movement around it. Dark vertical shapes standing near the outer edge of the illuminated pavement. Too tall, too thin. At first, I thought they were old speaker posts. Then one shifted position slightly, not walking, just suddenly somewhere else than before. Hum! The humming became continuous now. The pressure inside my ears deepened painfully, and the glow beneath the screen brightened enough that the cracked pavement reflected pale white around my boots. I remember becoming intensely aware of how isolated the place was. No nearby houses, no highway sounds anymore. Nothing except that low vibration filling the empty drive-in. Then the old speaker poles around the lot began vibrating softly. Metal rattling against metal, hundreds of tiny sounds across the darkness. The glow drifted slowly away from the movie screen toward me. Still perfectly smooth motion, still only illuminating the ground directly beneath it. I backed away automatically. The camera hanging around my neck vibrated faintly against my chest during each pulse. Hum. The continuous hum grew stronger, and for 1 second I thought I saw shadows moving across the movie screen itself. Tall, narrow silhouettes crossing slowly through pale reflected light, gone immediately when clouds shifted overhead. I remember trying to speak out loud just to break the silence. No sound came out at first. My throat felt tight and dry. Then suddenly all the sound crashed back at once. Wind roaring across the lot, speaker poles creaking, distant highway noise returning somewhere beyond the fields. The abrupt noise startled me hard enough I nearly dropped the camera. At the same moment, the glow stopped moving, hovered motionless for maybe another few seconds, then rose silently upward beside the movie screen and disappeared into the clouds. Gone. The drive-in immediately felt normal again. Cold wind moving through weeds, clouds drifting overhead, nothing unusual anywhere. I stood there breathing hard, staring at empty darkness for at least another minute before finally heading back toward my car. That's when I noticed the time. My phone read 12:41 a.m. I'd arrived shortly after 10. I couldn't account for nearly an hour. The strangest part happened after I got home. I uploaded the photos from the camera, expecting maybe blurry shots or overexposure. Instead, dozens of images taken near the screen showed almost nothing. Just blank white haze filling the frame. Not overexposed scenery, no visible ground, no screen, only pale white fog-like brightness. And mixed between them were several photos I didn't remember taking at all. Angles pointed low across the cracked pavement, toward empty sections of the drive-in lot, as if someone had been standing much closer to the ground holding the camera. I worked maintenance for a 6-building apartment complex outside Newark for about 3 years. Most of the job was boring stuff, replacing garbage disposals, fixing leaks, repainting hallways after people moved out. The buildings were old brick towers from the 70s with flat roofs and rooftop water tanks that constantly needed attention during winter. This happened in March during a week of freezing rain. I was covering the early shift because another guy named Luis called out sick. The property manager, Denise, wanted the rooftop tanks checked before tenants started waking up because people in Building 4 had complained about brown water the night before. I got there around 5:15 in the morning. Still dark out. Fog everywhere. Not thick enough to hide the buildings completely, but enough that the parking lot lights looked blurry and strange. The whole complex felt quieter than usual because the rain had stopped overnight and everything outside was coated in wet ice. I grabbed the roof keys and headed up Building 4. The elevators in that building were unreliable, so I took the stairs carrying a flashlight and toolbox. The higher I got, the colder it felt. By the time I reached the rooftop door, my fingers already hurt from the metal tools. The roof itself was slick with frozen rain. The water tank sat on a steel platform near the center with an old maintenance ladder bolted to the side. Nothing unusual up there normally besides pigeons and the sound of traffic from the interstate. That morning, the roof sounded dead quiet. Even the highway noise seemed muffled by the fog. I remember standing there for a second drinking coffee from a paper cup and noticing how bright the fog looked around the tank. Not glowing exactly, just pale. Then I saw the light. At first, I thought somebody had brought a drone up there. There was this soft white light hovering beside the tank about level with the catwalk, maybe 6 feet across. No blinking lights or anything mechanical looking, just pale and steady. It wasn't bright enough to light the roof. More like a reflection floating in the fog. I froze immediately. The light didn't move, neither did I. My first thought was honestly electrical fire, like maybe a transformer nearby arcing through the mist somehow. Then I realized there was no sound, no crackling, no buzzing, nothing. I took a few steps closer without meaning to. The light stayed beside the tank, perfectly still. It didn't really illuminate the metal either, which made it hard to judge distance. Sometimes it looked right beside the catwalk, other times farther out in the fog. I remember getting irritated at myself for feeling nervous. I worked around electrical stuff constantly. There had to be a normal explanation. So I walked toward the ladder. The second my hand touched the metal rail, I felt a vibration run through it. Not a shock, a hum, very low and steady. The ladder vibrated hard enough that I pulled my hand back automatically. The sound wasn't loud through the air, but through the metal it felt strong, almost like holding onto heavy machinery while it idled. I stared up at the tank. The pale light remained beside it, then slowly it drifted downward about a foot, not floating like a balloon. More controlled than that somehow. The fog around it shifted slightly as it moved. I should have gone back downstairs right then. Instead, I grabbed the ladder again. The humming started immediately through my palm. It traveled up my arm into my chest in this weird, uncomfortable way. Not painful, just wrong feeling. I climbed anyway. Every rung vibrated softly under my boots. Halfway up, I noticed the air smelled strange. Not smoke, more like wet concrete mixed with hot metal. I looked over at the light again. It hovered maybe 10 feet from me now. Same size, same pale color. I still couldn't make out edges clearly. It looked almost solid in the middle, but blurry around the outside. The fog behind it stayed visible through it somehow. That bothered me more than anything. I reached the catwalk and stepped onto it carefully because of the ice. The water tank itself looked normal. Rust stains, frozen runoff hanging from bolts. Nothing damaged. The light remained level with the catwalk, maybe 15 feet away now. Then the humming stopped. Completely. So suddenly that the silence made my ears ring. I stood there breathing hard without realizing it. That's when I heard something move behind me, not on the roof below, above me, a scraping sound across the top of the tank. I turned so fast I nearly slipped. There was nothing there, just the rounded metal roof of the tank disappearing into fog. Then came another sound, 3 knocks, slow and hollow from inside the tank. I remember every hair on my arm standing up instantly. I leaned closer toward the access hatch, listening. Nothing. Then another knock came from below my feet this time. Not water pipes, not shifting metal. It sounded deliberate. Knock, pause, knock, knock. I backed away so quickly my heel slipped on ice and slammed against the railing. My flashlight fell from my jacket pocket and bounced off the catwalk into the fog below. The pale light moved closer immediately after the flashlight disappeared. Not fast, just smooth. I could finally see it clearer now because it was near eye level. There wasn't really a shape inside it exactly, but something darker sat in the center, like a shadow suspended inside frosted glass. I kept staring because my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then the fog shifted around the tank, and for maybe 1 second I saw another shape standing on the rooftop below. Tall, thin, looking upward. I blinked and it was gone. The light drifted another foot closer. At that point I climbed down so fast I almost missed rungs. The ladder hummed violently under my hands now, strong enough that my wrists tingled. About halfway down, I realized something worse. The roof no longer looked familiar. I know how stupid that sounds, but the angles seemed wrong somehow. The nearby buildings looked farther away through the fog than they should have been. The parking lot lights below looked dimmer too. Even the sounds had changed again. No highway, no city noise, just that humming through the ladder. Then all at once, the humming stopped again, completely dead silent. I reached the rooftop and stepped away immediately. The pale light remained above beside the catwalk, except now it looked higher than before, like the tank itself had gotten taller somehow. I know that makes no sense. I backed toward the stairwell door without taking my eyes off it. That's when I noticed the rooftop access door standing open. I was positive I'd shut it behind me, because the wind usually slammed it otherwise. Darkness waited inside the stairwell. No light from below, just black. For a second, I honestly thought someone was standing inside watching me. Then the pale light shifted again. The movement caught my attention long enough for me to glance away from the door. When I looked back, the stairwell lights were on normally again, yellow and flickering. I went downstairs immediately. My legs felt shaky by the second landing. I kept stopping because I thought I heard footsteps above me on the roof, slow and uneven, but every time I listened carefully, there was nothing. On the 3rd floor, I passed a tenant walking her dog. The dog froze instantly when it saw me, not barking, just staring. Its ears flattened so hard they disappeared against its head. The woman laughed nervously and said, "Guess he doesn't like uniforms." But she looked unsettled too. I realized then my hands were trembling badly. When I reached the maintenance office downstairs, Denise was already there making coffee. She looked at me funny immediately. "You okay?" I asked her what time it was. She said 6:11. I checked my watch, 5:48. At first I thought the battery died, but the second hand moved normally. I pulled out my phone, 6:11 there too, exactly 23 minutes ahead. I actually laughed because I felt relieved for a second. A broken watch was normal, watches malfunctioned. Then Denise asked why I'd taken so long. I told her maybe 40 minutes. She stared at me. Tony, you went up there at 5:20. That hit me harder than it should have, because it didn't feel like 40 or 50 minutes. It felt maybe 15. I went into the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. While washing my hands, I noticed black grime under my fingernails. Not grease, more like soot. I couldn't remember touching anything dirty on the roof. The weirdest part happened later that morning. Around 9, Denise sent another maintenance guy named Eric up to the tank with me because the water pressure issue still hadn't been checked. I didn't tell him what happened. I just said the ladder felt unstable. The fog had burned off by then. Bright sunlight, normal city sounds. Everything looked ordinary again. When we got to the roof, the first thing I noticed was my flashlight lying near the base of the tank, exactly where it had fallen. Except the lens was cracked inward like something heavy stepped on it. Eric climbed the ladder first. No humming, no vibration, nothing unusual. The tank looked completely normal in daylight. But while Eric checked the hatch, I noticed something beside the ladder bolts. There were marks on the rooftop gravel. Long, shallow indentations curving away from the tank toward the edge of the building. Not footprints. More like something heavy had rested there briefly. Eric asked if I'd dropped paint or something because the gravel around the marks looked pale gray instead of black. I crouched down near one of them. The smell hit me immediately. Hot metal, same as before. Faint, but still there. I looked up toward the water tank. For a second I thought I saw movement reflected in the curved metal side. Not us. Something taller standing near the railing behind me. I turned around immediately. Nothing there except rooftop vents and sunlight. When I looked back at the tank, the reflection was gone. That night after work, I stopped at a deli near my apartment. The guy behind the counter glanced at my wrist and said, "Your watch is slow." I looked down. It still showed exactly 23 minutes behind the clock on the wall. I reset it right there while waiting for my food. The second hand ticked normally for about 5 seconds, then stopped completely. Not dead, just motionless. I wore that watch another 2 days before throwing it away. Because every morning after that, no matter how many times I fixed it, it ended up exactly 23 minutes behind again by sunrise. I was watching my neighbor's ranch outside of Casper for 4 days while he and his wife were in Billings visiting family. Mostly just feeding horses, checking fences, making sure pipes didn't freeze overnight. Easy work. This happened in November during a cold snap that rolled across central Wyoming. Dry cold. No snow yet, but the ground was stiff every morning and the wind never really stopped. His property sat miles from the highway. Just open land, low hills, fencing, and scattered power poles stretching into darkness. At night, the place felt isolated in a way cities never do. Once the porch lights were behind you, everything outside the flashlight beam disappeared. The horses stayed in a large fenced pasture behind the barn. 6 of them altogether. Calm animals. I'd been feeding them every evening around 10 because my schedule was backwards at the time and I stayed up late anyway. The first strange thing happened 2 nights before the main part. I was carrying feed buckets across the yard when every horse suddenly lifted its head at once. Not unusual by itself. But all 6 looked toward the same hill beyond the north fence at exactly the same moment. Then they froze. Completely still. No pacing, no tail movement, nothing. The wind was blowing hard enough to move their manes around, but the animals themselves looked almost locked in place. I stopped walking and looked toward the hill too. Nothing there. Just darkness and dead grass moving under moonlight. After maybe 20 seconds, one of them snorted loudly and they went back to normal. I didn't think much about it then. The second strange thing happened the following night. I woke up around 2:30 in the morning because something banged against the side of the house. I figured the wind knocked something loose outside, so I got up and checked through the kitchen window. The yard lights were on automatically, casting light across the barn and water troughs. Everything looked normal except the horses were awake. All 6 stood clustered near the north fence facing the hill again. perfectly still, same as before. I remember grabbing binoculars from the mudroom because something about the way they stood bothered me. Horses shift around constantly, especially in cold weather. These weren't moving at all. Through the binoculars, I could see their ears pointed forward, focused, watching. I scanned the hill expecting maybe coyotes or another animal. Nothing. Then one of the horses slowly backed away from the fence without turning around. That got my attention immediately because horses don't usually move like that unless they're spooked badly. I stepped outside onto the porch. The air smelled strange, almost like rain, even though the sky was clear and the wind had stopped completely. That part hit me hardest because Wyoming wind never fully stops. There's almost always something moving through the grass or rattling metal somewhere. Now everything was dead quiet. I stood there listening. Then I heard a low sound far off near the hill. Not mechanical exactly, more like a deep hum carried through the ground. I felt it faintly in the porch boards under my boots. The horses didn't react. They were already locked onto whatever was out there. I swept the hill with the binoculars again. Still nothing. Then one of the yard lights flickered behind me. I turned automatically. By the time I looked back toward the hill, the hum was gone. The horses relaxed almost immediately afterward and wandered apart again. I convinced myself it had been power lines or maybe distant machinery from one of the gas operations out there. The next night was worse. The temperature dropped hard after sunset. Clear sky, no moon. The kind of cold where your nostrils stick together when you breathe. Around 11, I headed out to check the water heaters in the troughs before going to bed. I remember the gravel crunching loudly under my boots because everything else felt unnaturally quiet again. The second I rounded the barn corner, I stopped walking. Every horse stood facing north, exactly aligned, not gathered together this time. Neste were spread across the pasture, all staring toward the same distant hill beyond the fence line. And none of them moved, not even slightly. One horse named Ranger usually paced constantly whenever somebody approached the fence. That horse didn't even blink. I called out, nothing. No reaction from the animals at all. The cold suddenly felt much stronger standing there watching them. I looked toward the hill. At first I thought it was a star near the horizon. There was a faint white light hovering just above the ridge. Very dim, not bright enough to cast shadows or anything dramatic, but wrong somehow. It sat too low and too still. I waited for blinking lights or aircraft movement. Nothing came. The light hovered silently maybe 20 feet above the hilltop. I checked for power poles or towers out there, but knew there weren't any. The land behind that ridge stayed empty for miles. One of the horses let out a low, nervous breath. Still none of them moved otherwise. I climbed through the fence carefully because I figured maybe they'd respond if I got closer. They didn't. I walked right up beside Ranger. His body felt rigid under my hand, muscles tight as cables. His ears remained pointed toward the hill. I actually pushed lightly against his shoulder. Nothing. It felt like trying to move a statue. That scared me more than the light itself. Then I noticed the sound again. The low hum. Barely audible. This time it seemed to come from everywhere at once instead of one direction. The fence wire beside me vibrated faintly. I touched it and immediately pulled my hand away because it buzzed strangely under my fingertips. Not enough to shock, just vibrating. The light over the hill drifted slightly sideways. Not fast, smooth. One of the horses shivered violently, but still refused to turn away. I looked around, suddenly realizing how isolated I was out there. The ranch house sat maybe 200 yards behind me. Beyond that, nothing but open land and darkness. My phone showed no signal. I started backing toward the fence. The hum grew slightly louder. Then the horses all inhaled sharply together. I know how insane that sounds, but every single one took the same deep breath at once. The light brightened slightly, not enough to illuminate the hill, just enough that its edges became clearer. Except the edges never fully settled. They shifted subtly like fog around a flashlight beam. I became aware then that the cold had disappeared. Not entirely, but the air around me felt strangely warm compared to seconds earlier. Warm enough that steam stopped coming from my breath. That realization hit me hard enough that panic finally started creeping in. I climbed back through the fence quickly. Halfway across the pasture, Ranger suddenly stamped once against the ground. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. Then all 6 horses slowly started stepping backward together without taking their eyes off the hill. The light remained motionless. The humming stopped. Instantly, complete silence dropped over everything. No wind, no fence vibration, nothing. Then I noticed another light farther right along the ridge, much dimmer and lower. For a second, I thought it was headlights cresting the hill. Except it hovered too. Both lights stayed perfectly still now above the ridgeline. The horses backed farther away from the north fence. I remember hearing my own heartbeat because everything else had gone so quiet. Then, from somewhere behind the hill, came a brief metallic sound. Not loud, just a distant clanging noise like empty pipes striking together. The leftmost light dipped downwards slightly. At the same moment, all 6 horses flinched violently. One finally broke and bolted sideways across the pasture, kicking hard enough to spray frozen dirt. The others followed instantly. That snapped me out of whatever frozen state I'd fallen into. I ran toward the barn. Behind me, the horses crashed against fencing and snorted wildly. I heard hooves tearing through frozen ground. When I reached the barn door, I looked back once. The lights were still there, except now they seemed farther apart than before, and lower, almost touching the ridge itself. Then both lights faded out together, not zipped away, not blinked, just slowly gone. The wind returned immediately afterward, hard. The sudden noise of it rushing across the pasture nearly made me jump. The horses kept running circles for another minute before settling near the south fence. I stayed inside the barn a while, pretending to organize tools because I didn't want to cross the yard alone yet. Eventually, I forced myself back to the house. Inside, the kitchen clock read 12:41 a.m. That confused me because I'd gone outside a little after 11, and it didn't feel remotely that long. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no texts, battery at 8% even though it had been nearly full earlier. I barely slept. Around 4 in the morning, I woke again because something tapped softly against the bedroom window. Not a knock exactly, more like fingernails brushing glass. I lay there listening. The sound came once more, very light. I finally got up and pulled the curtain aside. Nothing stood outside, just the dark yard and drifting grass under the security light. Then I noticed the horses again. All 6 had returned to the north fence, standing perfectly still, facing the hill. I used to take the first ferry across the Delaware River twice a week for work when I was helping on a construction project outside Cape May. The ferry left before sunrise, and during winter, most mornings looked the same. Dark water, cold wind, coffee from the terminal vending machine, same half-awake commuters standing around waiting to board. This happened in January during a stretch of heavy overcast weather. Not storming exactly, just low gray clouds hanging over everything for days straight, the kind where morning never fully brightens. That morning I got to the dock around 5:40 a.m., still pitch dark except for the terminal lights reflecting off wet pavement. The river looked black. Wind pushed small waves against the pilings beneath the dock, making those hollow knocking sounds wood makes near water. There were maybe 12 people waiting total. A woman with 2 kids asleep against her shoulders, 3 truck drivers drinking coffee near the loading lane, an older guy in camouflage sitting by the wall reading a newspaper. I remember checking the schedule board because the ferry should have arrived at 5:50. Nothing unusual yet. I walked outside near the railing overlooking the river while waiting. It was cold enough that the metal rail stung through my gloves. The sky overhead looked completely solid with clouds, no stars, no moon. Across the river, the opposite shoreline barely showed through the darkness. That's when I noticed the reflection. At first, I thought another boat was approaching. There was a bright white shape moving across the water toward the dock. But the weird thing was, I couldn't see anything above it causing the reflection. Usually when boats approach at night, you see navigation lights first. Red, green, white, whatever. This was different. The water itself looked illuminated. A long, pale reflection stretched across the surface, moving steadily toward shore. But when I looked up, there was nothing in the sky above it. Just low gray clouds. I squinted hard, trying to make sense of it. The reflection kept coming, smooth and silent, not rippling like ordinary light on water either. The brightness stayed strangely solid despite the waves underneath. One of the truck drivers noticed it too because he stepped closer beside me and said, "What the hell is that?" I remember feeling relieved somebody else saw it. He leaned against the railing, staring upriver. "You see a boat?" I said no. Neither of us could. The reflection moved faster than the current should have allowed. Still no sound, no engine, no visible lights above the waterline. Then something strange happened with the river itself. The waves near the reflection flattened, not completely calm, but smoother than the surrounding water, like oil spreading across the surface. The truck driver muttered, "Nope," under his breath and walked back toward the terminal. I stayed there. I don't know why exactly. I think my brain kept expecting a normal explanation to appear. Tugboat, helicopter spotlight, something. But there was nothing overhead. The reflection crossed maybe halfway toward the dock before slowing down. It remained bright for several seconds, hovering almost motionless on the water. Then it dimmed slightly. At that exact moment, every gull sitting on the dock pilings took off together. I hadn't even noticed them before because they were so quiet. Suddenly, maybe 20 birds exploded upwards, screaming into the dark. They circled once over the river and vanished inland. The terminal behind me went strangely quiet too. Conversation stopped. I turned around. Most of the waiting passengers were now outside staring toward the water. Nobody said much. The reflection remained there near the center of the river. Then it started moving again, straight toward the dock. Slow, steady, still no visible source above it. I became aware then that the air smelled odd. Not fishy river smell anymore. More like wet metal. Almost electrical. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket suddenly hard enough to startle me. Low battery warning. That made no sense because I'd charged it overnight. I pulled it out. Battery had dropped from 80% earlier to 9. While I stared at the screen, the terminal lights behind me flickered once. People murmured immediately. Then everything stabilized again. When I looked back toward the river, the reflection had stopped maybe 100 yards from shore. It stayed there motionless. The water around it looked darker somehow, not shadowed, just absent of normal reflections. I heard somebody behind me say, "Where's the ferry?" That snapped everyone's attention toward the empty river downstream. The ferry was late. Not massively late, but enough that people started checking watches. One of the employees came outside talking into a handheld radio. He looked irritated more than concerned. Then his radio let out a burst of static so loud several people jumped. I heard a voice inside the static for maybe half a second. Not words exactly, just sound. The employee smacked the side of the radio and walked away toward the loading area. The reflection on the river dimmed further. For a second, I thought it was sinking beneath the water. Then the ferry horn finally sounded somewhere in the fog downstream. Everybody turned toward it immediately. The sound felt wrong somehow, distant and strained. A few moments later, the ferry emerged through the darkness. It was moving slower than usual, way slower. Normally, it approached directly toward the dock in a straight line. This time, it drifted slightly sideways first before correcting itself. The reflection on the river vanished the second the ferry became fully visible. Not faded, gone instantly. The water returned to normal choppy black. I looked up again, expecting maybe to finally see aircraft lights overhead. Nothing there except clouds. The ferry pulled alongside the dock several minutes late. That's when I noticed the captain. He stood visible through the front windows near the controls. Older guy with gray hair and beard. I'd seen him before dozens of times. He looked pale, not tired, shaken. Another deckhand jumped out first to secure the lines. Usually they joked around with commuters sometimes, but that morning nobody said anything. The captain came down from the wheelhouse briefly while vehicles started loading. He kept looking back toward the river. Not casually either, like checking whether something was still out there. One of the regular commuters actually asked him if everything was okay. The captain hesitated before answering. Then he just said, "Had some instrument trouble." His voice sounded off, tight. The commuter laughed and said, "Thought maybe you guys hit something." The captain didn't answer that. He just stared out toward the river a second longer before walking away. I boarded with the foot passengers and went upstairs inside the cabin because the wind outside had gotten brutal. Normally the ferry felt noisy. Engines humming, people talking, televisions mounted in corners playing weather reports. That morning, the inside felt subdued. Several passengers kept glancing out the windows toward the river. I sat near the front with coffee from the snack counter, trying to convince myself the reflection had probably been some weird atmospheric thing. Then I noticed condensation streaking strangely across the windows, not dripping downward, sliding sideways. Very slowly, like gravity shifted slightly. A little kid sitting nearby noticed too, because he dragged his finger across the glass and asked his mom why the water was moving wrong. She pulled him away from the window immediately. Halfway across the river, the ferry slowed unexpectedly. Not fully stopped, just slower. People started looking around again. Outside the windows, the water appeared unusually dark compared to the cloudy sky, thick almost. Then came a sound underneath the ferry, a low metallic groan. Not from the engines, more like something dragging lightly against the hull. Several passengers heard it because conversations stopped immediately afterward. The sound continued maybe 5 seconds, then disappeared. The ferry accelerated again. I looked toward the front windows and saw the captain standing rigidly at the controls, staring straight ahead. One of the crew members came upstairs a minute later, checking windows for some reason. He moved quickly, avoiding eye contact with passengers. When he reached my side of the cabin, I asked quietly if something hit the boat earlier. He paused, then he said, "No, too fast." I asked why the ferry had slowed down. He glanced toward the front cabin before answering, "Current's weird today." Then he moved on immediately. The crossing finished without anything else happening. But when we reached the opposite dock, nobody stood up right away like usual. People stayed seated, waiting quietly until the ramp lowered. I overheard one truck driver telling another guy he'd seen light under the water before the ferry arrived. The other guy told him to shut up. Outside near the parking area, I passed 2 crew members smoking beside the terminal. One of them was the captain. He looked exhausted now. I heard the other crew member ask him quietly, "You telling the Coast Guard?" The captain shook his head immediately. Then he noticed me walking past and both men went silent. I drove to the construction site afterward, feeling off the entire morning. Hard to focus. Every reflective surface kept catching my attention. Puddles, windows, chrome mirrors on trucks. Around lunch, I checked my phone and realized the timestamp on several messages was wrong. Not wildly wrong. Exactly 11 minutes behind every other clock. At first, I thought the phone network updated incorrectly, crossing state lines or something, but the weird part was only messages received during the ferry crossing showed the wrong time. Everything before and after stayed normal. That evening, I took the return ferry home. Different captain, different crew. I stayed inside the car the whole crossing. As we pulled away from the dock, I looked once toward the water through the windshield. Near the center of the river, far from the ferry lanes, something bright moved slowly beneath the surface, not glowing strongly, just enough to reflect faintly upward against the dark water before slipping deeper out of sight. I drove through western Kansas a lot for work a few years back. Mostly overnight deliveries between warehouses, usually taking smaller highways because they were faster than dealing with interstate construction and way stations. There's a stretch out there where the road cuts directly through a massive wind farm for miles. Hundreds of turbines spread across empty fields on both sides of the highway. During the day, it looks normal enough, but at night, the red warning lights make the whole place feel strange. This happened in early December. Cold night. No snow yet, but freezing wind blowing hard across the plains. Clouds moving low and fast enough to hide the stars most of the time. I'd been driving for hours already by then. Around 1 a.m., I turned onto a county highway running straight through the wind farm. The turbines were impossible to miss. Huge black shapes spinning slowly against the clouds with blinking red lights scattered everywhere across the fields. The wind outside sounded constant too. Even inside the truck, I could hear it pushing against the trailer and whistling around the mirrors. Everything felt normal at first. I had the radio low and cruise control set, while the turbines passed endlessly on both sides. Then I noticed one wasn't moving. At first, I assumed maintenance shut it down. One turbine stood ahead on the left side of the highway, completely still, while every other one around it rotated normally in the wind. Its red warning light blinked like the others, but beside it hung something pale, a dim white glow hovering near the blades maybe halfway up the tower, not attached to the turbine itself, just suspended beside it. I remember leaning closer to the windshield trying to figure out what I was looking at. The glow stayed perfectly still despite the wind, soft white, not bright enough to illuminate the whole structure, just enough that one side of the tower reflected faintly against the darkness. Then came the humming, low, barely audible beneath the truck engine and wind. Whum. I felt it through the steering wheel more than heard it. Several seconds later again. Whum. The glow brightened slightly during each pulse. That's when the truck engine sputtered the first time. Not enough to stall, just rough vibration through the cab like bad fuel or electrical trouble. The dashboard lights dimmed faintly during the pulse, too. I checked gauges automatically. Everything looked normal, but the farther I drove toward the still turbine, the rougher the engine sounded. Whum! The vibration deepened. Loose paperwork on the passenger seat trembled softly during the pulse, and the wind noise outside began fading. At first I thought maybe the road dipped lower between hills, but within another minute the sound softened unnaturally. The constant rush against the trailer disappeared. Even the tire noise against pavement sounded distant. The glow beside the turbine remained fixed at blade height, perfectly motionless. Every other turbine around it continued spinning normally. That contrast bothered me more than anything else. The wind farm looked alive everywhere except that one tower. Whum! The pulse came stronger. The truck engine coughed hard this time. RPMs dipped briefly before stabilizing again. The radio crackled into static for maybe 2 seconds, and the glow brightened enough that the nearby field reflected pale white beneath it. I remember checking my phone mounted beside the dash. No signal. Battery draining rapidly despite being plugged in. The screen flickered weakly before going black completely. Whop! The vibrations spread through the cab harder now. The steering wheel buzzed faintly beneath my hands, and the turbine warning lights across the fields began looking strange, not blinking naturally anymore. Some seemed delayed, others paused longer than they should. Then I realized something worse. The still turbine's blades had changed position slightly without rotating there. 1 second angled upward, next second lower. No visible movement between. Just different. The glow remained fixed beside it the whole time. Then all sound vanished. No engine, no wind, no tire noise, nothing. The truck still rolled forward down the highway, but the silence felt impossible. I remember gripping the wheel so hard my hands cramped. The engine gauges still moved. The trailer still shook slightly from the road, but there was absolutely no sound attached to any of it. Only the humming remained. Whum! Continuous now. The pressure inside my ears built painfully. The glow beside the turbine brightened further. Fog or dust around the base of the tower curled upward slowly beneath it against the direction of the wind. And for 1 second, I thought I saw dark vertical shapes standing near the fence line below the turbine. Too tall, too thin, motionless. Gone immediately when headlights shifted. Whoop! The truck engine began running rough enough then that I thought it might die completely. The cab lights dimmed pale gray. The radio display flickered randomly, and the still turbine loomed directly beside the road now. I glanced toward it again. The blades remained frozen, but the pale glow had moved closer to the tower itself, near enough that one blade reflected dull white against the clouds. Then the truck lurched slightly, not like hitting rough pavement, more like the road suddenly stopped resisting the tires for a second. The sensation lasted maybe 2 seconds before disappearing. The humming deepened hard enough that I felt it in my chest, and during one pulse, every turbine warning light visible across the wind farm stopped blinking simultaneously, all frozen red at once. The entire landscape looked wrong instantly, miles of towers standing motionless beneath steady red lights. At the exact same moment, the glow beside the turbine brightened enough that I saw several dark figures standing beneath it near the access road, completely still, facing the highway. Then every sound crashed back violently. Wind hammering the truck, engine roaring, radio blasting static loud enough to make me flinch. The sudden noise startled me so badly I drifted halfway onto the shoulder before correcting. The turbines resumed blinking normally immediately afterward. The still turbine began rotating slowly again like nothing had happened, and the glow beside it rose silently upward into the clouds until it disappeared completely. Gone. The truck engine smoothed out almost immediately once I passed the area. The radio returned to normal. Phone rebooted itself beside the dash. Everything suddenly felt ordinary again. I kept driving another 30 miles before realizing something was wrong with the time. The dashboard clock showed 2:18 a.m. According to the route, I should have already been near Salina almost 45 minutes earlier. The strangest part happened at the next fuel stop. While walking around the truck checking tires, I noticed fine gray dust covering the driver's side door and mirror. Not dirt from the road, more like powder. And dragged through the dust across the window were several long curved streaks, like fingertips had slowly traced through it while the truck was moving. I lived in a second-floor apartment overlooking a little dog park in western Pennsylvania. Nothing fancy. 3 brick buildings around a patchy square of grass with a rusted swing set nobody used anymore. The dog park sat behind it, fenced in with cheap chain link. During the day, it was always noisy. Barking, owners yelling names, tennis balls smacking wet grass. At night, it usually went dead quiet. This happened in July 2 years ago during a heat wave. No wind for days. Even after midnight, the air still felt thick and warm. I'd been sleeping badly all week because nobody in the complex had AC strong enough to handle the heat, so everybody had windows open all night. You could hear everything: TVs, arguments, people coughing, dogs pacing around apartments. That night, I went to bed around 1. I remember waking up suddenly and thinking somebody had screamed, but after a few seconds, I realized it wasn't a scream. It was dogs whining. Not barking, whining. Every single dog in the park area at once. I sat up in bed confused because it sounded awful. Low, nervous whining coming from multiple directions, some of them scratching at doors. One dog nearby making this weird choking sound like it was scared. I checked my phone, 3:17 a.m. The whining kept going. It was non-stop. Not loud exactly, just constant, uneasy, like something had them all worked up at the same time. Then I realized something else. No people were talking. Usually if dogs started going nuts in the middle of the night, owners yelled at them. Lights came on. Somebody cursed through a window. Nothing. The whole complex felt dead. I got out of bed and walked to the window. At first, I didn't notice anything strange. The courtyard looked normal. Parking lot empty, except for a few cars under the yellow lamps. Then I looked past the dog park. There was a field behind it. Mostly unused grass leading toward a line of trees and a drainage ditch. Kids sometimes cut through there during the day. There was a light hanging over the middle of the field. Not bright. That's the part that bothered me most afterward. If it had been bright, I probably would have assumed helicopter or spotlight or something, but this thing was dim, soft white, almost dull looking, and perfectly still. It wasn't high up either, maybe 20 or 30 feet above the ground. I remember squinting because it looked weirdly flat. Not shaped like a floodlight. More like if somebody held a flashlight behind frosted glass. The dogs kept whining. One started yelping somewhere nearby. I opened my window wider and leaned out. The air smelled strange, like rain coming, even though the sky was completely clear. No sound came from the field. No insects either. That hit me after a minute. Usually summer nights, they were loud with crickets, frogs down near the ditch. You could hear traffic from the highway a mile away. Nothing now, just dogs. I stayed there watching the light for maybe 5 minutes, maybe longer. It never moved. A few apartment windows had lights on now. I noticed silhouettes standing in them. Everybody was just looking. Nobody yelled anything. I thought about recording it with my phone, but honestly, I felt embarrassed. Like maybe it was something obvious and I'd look stupid. Then something changed. The light dimmed slightly, and for a second I thought it was drifting downward, not fast, barely moving. But at the same time, all the dogs stopped whining together, instantly. The silence hit so hard it made my stomach tighten. I remember hearing my own refrigerator humming behind me. Then every dog started barking at once. Aggressive barking this time, loud, panicked. I looked back toward the field and saw movement underneath the light. At first I thought it was a person. Then I realized I couldn't really tell what I was seeing. It looked too tall, maybe, or stretched wrong somehow. Hard to explain. like a shadow standing upright in grass. I kept trying to focus on it, but my eyes wouldn't settle right. The shape seemed blurry around the edges even though everything else looked normal. The light drifted sideways slowly. The shape moved with it. That's when I felt this really strong urge to back away from the window. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling you get when you accidentally make eye contact with someone dangerous on public transit. Like I suddenly became aware that maybe it could see me too. I stepped back without even thinking about it. The barking got worse. Then, all at once, the light disappeared. Not shot upward, not faded out slowly, just gone. The field turned completely dark again. The dogs stopped barking maybe 10 seconds later. I stood there waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, apartment lights started turning off again, one by one. I stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, I ran into my downstairs neighbor, Gina, while getting coffee from the lobby machine. She looked exhausted. Before I even mentioned anything, she said, "Did you wake up around 3 too?" That immediately made my chest feel tight. I asked why. She said all 3 of her dogs woke up whining at the exact same time. She thought somebody was outside her window. Then she asked if I'd seen the light. I told her yes. She just stared at me for a second like she expected me to laugh. Instead, I asked what she thought it was. She shook her head immediately. No idea, but my husband saw it too. Over the next day, I heard other people talking about it around the complex. An older guy named Raymond said his digital clock beside his bed had frozen at 3:17 for almost an hour afterward. A woman in Building C said her kids woke up crying at exactly the same time, even though they slept through thunderstorms normally. Somebody else claimed car alarms started going off briefly near the back lot, though I never heard them myself. Nobody had an explanation. The weirdest part came 2 nights later. I was taking trash out around 11 when I noticed several dogs refusing to walk near the back side of the complex facing the field. One golden retriever planted itself flat against the sidewalk and wouldn't move. Its owner kept tugging the leash while apologizing. The dog looked terrified. I started glancing toward the field every night after that. Nothing unusual for a while. Then, maybe a week later, I woke up again around 3 in the morning. This time there was no whining, no barking, just silence. I checked my phone, 3:16 a.m. The second I saw the time, my heart started hammering. I went to the window immediately. The field looked empty, but near the tree line, something pale moved slowly between the grass and disappeared into the dark. Not glowing, just lighter than everything around it. I stared so hard my eyes watered. Then from somewhere far below, one dog let out a long, shaky whine. Another answered from a different building, then another. I backed away from the window and shut it completely. A few seconds later, there was a soft metallic popping sound outside somewhere near the parking lot, like cooling metal. Then nothing. I stayed in bed until sunrise, listening for movement outside my apartment door, because for some reason I became convinced something had crossed the courtyard and entered the building. The next morning I found muddy footprints on the concrete outside the rear entrance downstairs. Not unusual by themselves, except it hadn't rained in over a week, and the prints stopped halfway down the hallway, like whoever made them never walked back out. I worked maintenance for a weather monitoring company for about a year and a half. Most of the job involved driving out to remote stations that collected wind, temperature, and seismic data for state agencies and utility companies. A lot of the sites sat in isolated places nobody ever visited unless equipment failed. This happened outside Raton, New Mexico. One of our hillside stations stopped transmitting correctly after a storm, and so my supervisor sent me out to check the instruments before another system moved in. I got there late afternoon. The station sat on a long, rocky hillside overlooking miles of empty scrubland and distant highway. Just metal fencing, solar panels, antenna masts, and a small equipment shed bolted into the rocks. No nearby houses, no power lines, nothing except wind and open land. The sky stayed overcast most of the day, cold gray clouds moving low over the hills with occasional mist blowing through. By around 5 p.m., I'd already replaced one damaged sensor and started recalibrating the data logger inside the equipment shed. Everything seemed normal at first. The station emitted the usual little noises, cooling fans humming, occasional clicks from relays, wind rattling the guy wires outside. I remember checking recordings on one of the monitors when the numbers suddenly froze. Not glitched, not scrambled, just stopped. Wind speed, barometric pressure, temperature, everything locked completely still. At first, I assumed the system crashed. Then I noticed every instrument inside the shed had stopped at exactly the same moment. Even backup indicators froze. The tiny fan above the battery rack slowed gradually until it stopped turning. The sudden quiet felt strange immediately. I stepped outside thinking maybe the power system failed. The wind had dropped too, not completely. I could still see brush moving slightly farther down the hillside. But around the station itself, the air felt unnaturally still. Then I noticed the light. A bright white glow low on the horizon west of the hills, not high in the sky, barely above the land itself. At first I thought headlights reflected through fog somewhere far away, but the glow stayed motionless, soft white, too large and steady to be a vehicle, and bright enough that I could see faint reflection off the station fencing around me. I stood there staring at it for probably 20 seconds. No sound came from that direction. No aircraft lights, nothing. Then the humming started. Low, barely audible. Whum! I felt it faintly through the soles of my boots. Several seconds later again. Whum! The glow brightened slightly during each pulse. The metal fence around the station vibrated softly in response. I checked my watch automatically. 5:17 p.m. The second hand moved normally. Whum! The vibration deepened. Loose tools sitting on the tailgate of my truck rattled faintly together during the pulse, and the silence around the hillside became more noticeable. No birds, no wind, nothing except the low humming. I walked farther from the shed, trying to get a clearer view across the hills. The glow remained fixed near the horizon. Fog drifted strangely beneath it too, not moving with the wind, curling slowly upward in thin spirals. Whum! The pressure inside my ears shifted painfully during the pulse. I remember touching one ear automatically because it suddenly felt clogged. That's when I realized the instruments inside the shed still hadn't resumed. Every monitor visible through the open doorway remained frozen, the fan still motionless. Even the digital clock above the workbench had stopped changing. 5:17 p.m. Whum! The humming became continuous now. The vibrations spread faintly through the rocky ground beneath my boots, and the glow on the horizon brightened enough that low clouds above it reflected pale white. I remember becoming intensely aware of how isolated the hillside was. No nearby roads visible from that angle, no other workers, just me standing beside silent equipment while something glowed motionless beyond the hills. Then I noticed movement near the fence line downhill from the station, dark vertical shapes standing among the scrub brush. At first I thought fence posts, then one appeared slightly closer the second time I looked. No visible walking, just different position. Whum! The vibration deepened hard enough that I felt it in my chest. The tools on the truck tailgate buzzed faintly against the metal, and the glow drifted slightly higher above the horizon. Still perfectly smooth motion, still silent. Then all sound vanished completely. No humming, no distant wind, nothing. The silence hit so suddenly my stomach tightened. I could still see my jacket moving slightly from cold air, but there was absolutely no sound attached to anything anymore. The hillside looked frozen. Even the clouds overhead seemed slower somehow. Then the station lights flickered once. Every indicator inside the shed flashed pale white simultaneously. And during that brief brightness, I thought I saw several tall silhouettes standing motionless beside the lower fence. Too thin, too tall, facing uphill toward the station, gone immediately afterward. The glow near the horizon brightened further, and for 1 second the entire hillside reflected faint white light. Not enough to fully illuminate anything. Just enough that every rock and bush looked washed out and flat. Then the humming returned violently. Loud enough now that I physically flinched. The ground vibrated beneath my boots during the pulse, and every instrument inside the shed suddenly came back online all at once. Fans spinning, screens refreshing, data scrolling rapidly across monitors. The digital clock jumped forward instantly. 5:24 p.m., exactly 7 minutes. I remember staring at the clock because the precision of it bothered me more than anything else. Not 6 minutes, not 8, exactly 7. The glow remained visible on the horizon another few seconds. Then it rose silently upward into the cloud cover and disappeared completely. Gone. The wind returned immediately afterward, cold air sweeping hard across the hillside again, brush rustling normally, guy wires humming softly, everything suddenly ordinary. I stood there for a long time just listening to normal sounds return. Eventually, I went back inside the shed and checked the data logs. There was a perfect 7-minute gap across every instrument. No corrupted files, no spikes, just blank missing time. The strangest part happened after dark while driving back toward town. I stopped at a gas station and noticed dirt streaked across both sleeves of my jacket. Not mud, more like fine gray dust. And pressed faintly into the dust around my left forearm were 4 long parallel marks, like something with narrow fingers had gripped the fabric tightly. I kept a small fishing boat at a marina near Gulf Shores for a couple years. Nothing expensive, just an old center console I used on weekends whenever work gave me time off. The marina stayed busy during summer, but by late November, most slips sat empty at night. A lot of people pulled their boats for the season once colder weather rolled in. This happened during one of the last trips I took before winter. Cold, damp night, thick clouds overhead and occasional mist blowing in from the bay. Not storming exactly, but the air felt heavy and wet. I'd stayed out later than planned because the engine gave me trouble offshore, and by the time I got back near the harbor, it was after midnight. The marina lights looked dim through the fog while I eased the boat between empty slips. Everything felt unusually quiet. No music from nearby docks. No generators running on larger boats. Even the water sounded muted somehow. I tied off near the end of the pier and shut the engine down. The silence afterward felt strange immediately. Usually you still hear waves knocking against hulls or rigging clinking in the wind. That night there was barely anything. Just distant water movement somewhere beyond the harbor. I grabbed my gear and started walking down the dock toward the parking lot. That's when I noticed the reflection. A pale white glow stretched across the harbor water near the far slips. At first, I assumed another boat approached outside the marina entrance, but the reflection didn't move naturally with the water. It stayed smooth and circular while everything around it rippled from the wind. I stopped walking. The reflection drifted slowly between the slips without disturbing the water beneath it. Soft white, not bright enough to illuminate the boats nearby. Just visible enough that the harbor surface glowed faintly around it. I remember looking toward the source automatically. Nothing there, no boat lights, no helicopter overhead, no visible object in the sky at all, only dark clouds hanging low above the marina. I looked back down at the water. The reflection had moved closer. Still no visible source above it. That's when the humming started. Low. Barely audible. Whum. I felt it faintly through the dock boards beneath my shoes. Several seconds later again. Whum. The reflection brightened slightly during each pulse. The water beneath it remained unnaturally smooth. I stood there staring way too long trying to understand what I was seeing. The marina around me felt emptier by the second. Rows of dark boats rocking gently in their slips, fog drifting through mast lines, no people anywhere. Whump. The vibration deepened slightly. Metal cleats along the dock rattled softly during the pulse, and the harbor sounds began fading. The occasional slap of water against pilings softened first. Then the distant buoy bell somewhere outside the marina disappeared too. Within another minute, the entire harbor felt muted. The pale reflection drifted farther between the slips toward shore. Still no visible object above it. I pulled my phone out to record the water. No signal, battery at 3%, despite charging it earlier in the boat. The screen brightness dimmed almost immediately. Mum. The pulse came stronger this time. The wooden dock vibrated faintly beneath my feet. And for 1 second, the reflection brightened enough that nearby boat hulls reflected pale white across wet fiberglass. That's when I noticed movement near the fuel dock farther down the marina. Dark vertical shapes standing motionless near the edge of the pier. At first, I thought other boat owners walking around, but they were too still, too narrow. And one looked closer the second time I glanced over. Whump! The pressure inside my ears shifted painfully during the pulse. The reflection in the harbor stopped moving, completely still now near the middle of the slips, and the water around it began trembling faintly in perfect circles. Then all sound vanished. No wind, No water. Nothing. The silence hit so suddenly my chest tightened. I could still see ropes moving gently against nearby boats from the current, but there was absolutely no sound attached to them anymore. Only the low humming remained. Continuous now. The vibration traveled through the dock beneath my shoes, hard enough that loose keys in my pocket rattled softly. The reflection brightened further. Fog above the harbor water curled upward in slow spirals around it. I remember becoming intensely aware that I was alone out there. No security carts, no voices, no traffic from the road beyond the marina. Nothing except rows of empty boats and that pale reflection sliding silently across the water. Then my car alarm started going off, loud enough it nearly made me jump off the dock. The sound exploded across the marina while everything else remained silent. I turned immediately toward the parking lot. My truck sat near the far fence, flashing headlights repeatedly. No one stood near it. No movement anywhere around the lot. The alarm continued blaring. When I looked back toward the harbor, the reflection was gone. Completely gone. The water looked black and normal again beneath the fog. But the humming continued. Whum! The continuous vibration deepened hard enough now that I felt it in my teeth. And somewhere between the slips ahead, I thought I saw something move beneath the water. Not surfacing, just darker motion below the reflections. I started walking quickly toward shore then, not running yet, but close. The car alarm kept echoing across the marina, and during each pulse from the humming, the truck headlights dimmed briefly before flashing bright again. Mum. The pressure in my ears became painful. The fog around the parking lot thickened strangely too, not drifting naturally, curling low across the pavement toward the docks. Then all the marina lights flickered at once. Dock lamps, parking lot lights, security floodlights near the fuel station. Everything dimming pale gray for maybe 2 seconds. At the exact same moment, the humming intensified hard enough that I stopped walking completely. And for 1 second, I thought I saw several tall silhouettes standing motionless between the parked boats along the nearest slips. Then every sound crashed back at once. Water slapping against hulls, wind rattling loose rigging, my truck alarm blaring normally again. The sudden noise startled me hard enough I nearly slipped off the dock edge. The humming stopped immediately afterward, gone completely. The marina looked normal again. Cold fog, dark water, empty slips rocking gently in the wind. I reached the parking lot a minute later and shut the truck alarm off. Nothing appeared wrong. Doors still locked, no scratches, nothing disturbed inside. I checked the time once I got behind the wheel, 1:47 a.m. That confused me immediately because docking the boat should have taken maybe 15 minutes at most, nearly an hour missing. The strangest part happened after I got home. While unloading gear from the truck bed, I noticed wet handprints streaked faintly across the passenger side windows. Long, narrow prints. Not fully human-shaped exactly, and mixed into the moisture were tiny grains of white salt crust that glittered faintly under the driveway light, even after the glass dried. I used to fish alone a lot along the Outer Banks near Port O'Connor in Texas, mostly because my work schedule was weird, and I liked being out there before sunrise when the water stayed quiet. There was a long stretch near the marshes where you could park beside an old gravel pull-off and walk down to the shoreline without seeing another person for hours. This happened in February. Cold morning, thick clouds overhead and strong wind pushing across the bay, hard enough to kick up rough water near shore. The air smelled like rain even though nothing had started yet. I got there around 4:30 a.m. Still completely dark except for distant refinery lights way across the water. The tide was moving fast and the waves slapped hard against the rocks lining the shore. Everything felt normal. I carried my tackle bag down near the waterline, set up 2 rods, and started fishing while drinking coffee from a thermos. The wind made casting annoying. The line kept bowing sideways over the water. I remember thinking I probably should have stayed home because conditions sucked. But after a while, you stop noticing discomfort out there. You just settle into the sounds. Wind, waves, reel clicking occasionally, that kind of thing. About 40 minutes later, I noticed the water ahead looking strange, not close to shore. Farther out beyond casting distance, maybe 100 yards or more. A dark patch sat on the surface where the waves suddenly disappeared. At first, I thought it was shadow from clouds overhead, but the surrounding water still looked rough and choppy from the wind. Only that section stayed perfectly smooth, flat like black glass. I stood up from my folding chair trying to see better. That's when I noticed the light above it. A soft white glow hovering low over the water, maybe 20 feet up. Not bright enough to illuminate everything around it, just enough that the smooth patch beneath reflected pale white against the darkness. I remember checking the shoreline around me, expecting another boat offshore. Nothing there. No engine sounds, no navigation lights. The glow remained perfectly still above the glassy water. Then came the humming. Low, barely audible beneath the wind. Whum! I felt it faintly through the rocks under my boots. Several seconds later again. Whum! The glow brightened slightly during each pulse. The dark water beneath it widened outward. I reeled one line in automatically, thinking maybe weather interference or something electrical affected the water. The bait came back untouched, cold and dripping normally. Then the second fishing rod bent slightly, not hard like a fish strike, just tension pulling steadily outward. I grabbed it quickly. The line suddenly went completely slack, not snapped, just dead loose. I reeled fast, expecting tangled line or lost bait. But when the hook came back in, the bait remained attached, perfectly untouched. That bothered me more than anything else at first. Whum. The vibration deepened slightly. My tackle box beside the chair rattled softly during the pulse, and the wind around the shoreline started fading, not stopping completely, just sounding farther away. The waves near shore softened too. Within another minute, the entire bay felt muted somehow. The only rough water left anywhere was far beyond the smooth dark patch beneath the glow. Everything else looked strangely subdued. Whum. The pressure inside my ears shifted painfully during the pulse. The glow brightened further. Fog or mist began curling upward from the water beneath it, despite the wind pushing another direction. I remember checking my phone automatically. No signal. Battery draining rapidly despite being nearly full earlier. The screen dimmed before locking itself. Whum. The vibration spread through the shoreline rocks beneath my feet. My fishing rods trembled lightly in their holders, and somewhere behind me near the marsh grass, I thought I heard movement. Not footsteps exactly, just careful shifting through reeds. I turned around immediately. Nothing visible except dark grass moving in the wind. When I looked back toward the water, the glow had drifted closer, still hovering silently over the dark, glassy patch. Still perfectly smooth motion, and the waves beneath it remained completely flat despite strong wind everywhere else. That's when all the normal sounds vanished. No waves, no wind, nothing. The silence hit so suddenly it made my chest tighten. I could still see water moving farther out in the bay, but there was absolutely no sound attached to it anymore. Only the low humming remained. Continuous now. The vibration filled my ears hard enough that my jaw hurt. The glow brightened enough that wet rocks along the shoreline reflected pale white around me. And for 1 second I thought I saw shapes moving beneath the smooth, dark water. Long shadows sliding silently under the surface, not surfacing, just there, gone immediately afterward. I remember backing away from the shoreline, slowly then. The glow drifted closer again, near enough now that I could see mist spiraling upward beneath it in slow rotating patterns. The continuous hum deepened harder. The fishing rods beside me vibrated faintly against their metal holders, and the glassy patch on the water widened farther toward shore. The bay looked wrong, like somebody had cut a perfectly smooth hole into rough water. Then something tugged sharply on one of the rods, hard enough that it nearly bent sideways. I grabbed it immediately. Again, the line went totally slack, instantly. No resistance, no snapped line, nothing. I reeled fast. The hook returned empty this time, but the line itself felt strangely warm against my fingers. That's when I noticed movement farther down the shoreline. Dark figures standing near the rocks, maybe 50 yards away. Too tall, too still. At first, I thought other fishermen somehow appeared without me noticing, but none moved naturally, and during one pulse from the humming, one seemed suddenly closer than before. Mum! The pressure in my ears became almost unbearable. The glow hovered maybe only 50 yards offshore now, and during one bright pulse, the smooth water beneath it reflected enough light that I saw several dark shapes standing motionless waist deep inside the glassy patch. Then all the sound crashed back violently. Wind roaring across the bay, waves hammering the shoreline, my loose tackle clattering against the rocks. The sudden noise startled me hard enough, I stumbled backward into my chair. At the same moment, the glow rose silently upward. The smooth patch beneath it broke apart instantly into rough, choppy waves again, and within another few seconds, the light disappeared into the low cloud cover. Gone. Everything immediately looked normal again. Cold, dark water, wind pushing hard across the bay, nothing unusual anywhere. I stood there breathing hard, staring offshore for probably another minute before finally deciding to pack up. That's when I checked the time, 6:11 a.m. The last time I looked at my watch, it'd been shortly after 5. Over an hour missing. The strangest part happened after sunrise while loading gear back into the truck. One of my rods had deep scratches running along the cork handle, 4 thin parallel grooves, and packed inside the grooves was wet black mud that smelled strongly like stagnant marsh water, even though the rod had never touched the shoreline. I worked overnight maintenance at a regional airport outside Tulsa for almost 3 years. Mostly boring stuff. Fence inspections, checking runway lights, looking for debris after storms, replacing bulbs, driving the perimeter roads while everybody else slept. The airport itself wasn't huge. 2 runways, 1 small terminal, cargo hangars on the north side. At night, the place usually felt half abandoned, except for occasional freight traffic and private jets landing before dawn. This happened in early March. Cold night with low clouds hanging over the airfield and strong wind blowing across the runways. Not raining yet, but storms were moving in from the west. Around 2 a.m., I was driving one of the perimeter roads near the south fence line in an old maintenance pickup. The job got repetitive after a while. Drive slow, check for damaged fencing, watch for animals, report burnt-out lights, that kind of thing. The runway lights stretched across the darkness ahead in long rows of blinking red and white markers. Everything looked normal at first. I remember listening to weather chatter on the truck radio while driving beside the outer fence. Wind buffeted the truck hard enough that it rocked slightly during stronger gusts. Clouds moved fast over the field. Then I noticed the light. At first, I thought another aircraft lined up for approach beyond the runway, a pale white glow hovering low in the distance past the far end of runway 18. But after another few seconds, I realized it wasn't moving. Planes never stay perfectly still like that, especially in heavy wind. The glow hovered maybe 50 feet above the ground beyond the airport fence, soft white, not bright enough to illuminate the runway fully, just enough that I could see faint reflection off wet pavement and grass. I slowed the truck automatically. No engine noise, no navigation lights blinking around it, nothing except pale white hanging motionless beneath the clouds. Then came the humming, low, barely audible over the wind. Whump! I felt it faintly through the steering wheel. Several seconds later again, whump! The glow brightened slightly during each pulse. I grabbed the radio mic and called tower, asked if anything sat beyond the south approach zone. Long pause, then the controller came back confused. Nothing on radar. No incoming traffic. No maintenance scheduled out there. I kept staring at the glow while talking. It remained perfectly still despite wind visibly whipping grass along the runway edges. Whum! The vibration deepened. Loose tools on the passenger seat rattled softly during the pulse. That's when I noticed something stranger. The runway lights ahead had stopped blinking. At first I thought maybe the timing synced weirdly. But then I looked farther across the field. Every warning light visible from the road remained frozen. Red tower beacons, runway strobes, approach lights, all locked steady without flashing. The entire airfield suddenly looked wrong because of it. Too still, too quiet. I remember lowering the truck window slightly despite the cold. The wind outside sounded weaker suddenly, then weaker again. Within another minute, the usual airport noise faded almost completely. No distant jet engines. No generators humming from the terminal. Nothing except the low vibration. Whum! The pulse hit stronger this time. The dashboard lights dimmed briefly, and the pale glow beyond the runway brightened enough that low clouds above it reflected dull white. I checked the radio again, only static now. Not normal radio hiss either. Heavy distorted crackling that rose and fell with the humming pulses. Whum! The pressure inside my ears shifted painfully during that pulse. The glow drifted slightly closer toward the runway threshold. still completely smooth motion, still silent. And beneath it, the grass beyond the fence flattened outward in slow circles, despite the wind blowing another direction. That's when I noticed movement near the runway edge lights farther ahead. Dark, vertical shapes standing motionless beside the pavement. At first I thought maintenance markers or signs, but they looked too narrow, too tall. And one seemed farther forward the next time I glanced over. Mum. The vibration deepened hard enough now that the rearview mirror trembled. The truck engine still idled normally, but the sound felt distant somehow. Muted. Then all sound vanished completely. No wind, no engine, no radio static, nothing. The silence hit so abruptly my chest tightened. I could still see airport windsocks whipping violently across the field through the fence. But there was absolutely no sound attached to them. The frozen runway lights remained steady and unmoving, and the pale glow hovered just beyond the runway, now near enough that white reflection shimmered faintly across the truck hood. The humming became continuous. I felt it physically inside my ears more than heard it. The steering wheel vibrated beneath my hands, and for 1 second the glow brightened enough that I saw fog moving underneath it in slow spirals, not drifting naturally, rotating. Then something crossed the runway, not running, not walking clearly either. Just a dark shape moving silently through the pale reflection near the edge lights. Gone immediately afterward. I remember gripping the radio mic hard enough my hand cramped. Tower still answered nothing but static. Bum. The glow drifted higher slightly. The continuous vibration spread through the truck floorboards, and then the warning lights changed again. Instead of remaining frozen, every blinking light across the airport suddenly synchronized perfectly, all flashing together. Red, dark, entire airfield pulsing at once. The pale glow beyond the runway brightened during each flash. I checked the dashboard clock automatically, 2:14 a.m. The numbers flickered weakly. Then the truck headlights dimmed sharply. For maybe 1 second, everything outside looked washed pale gray beneath the hovering light. And during that second, I thought I saw several tall silhouettes standing along the fence line ahead of the truck, motionless, facing the runway. Then all the sound crashed back at once. Wind hammering the truck, radio exploding with static, a departing jet roaring somewhere beyond the terminal. The sudden noise made me jump hard enough I nearly dropped the radio mic. At the same moment, every airport warning light resumed blinking normally. Unsynchronized again. The glow beyond the runway remained visible maybe another 10 seconds. Then it rose silently into the low clouds and disappeared completely. Gone. The radio crackled immediately afterward. Tower asking why I'd stopped responding for nearly 40 minutes. That confused me instantly. From my perspective, maybe 10 minutes had passed at most. I checked the clock again, 2:57 a.m. The strangest part happened near sunrise. While fueling the maintenance truck before ending shift, I noticed faint moisture patterns across the windshield. Long curved streaks running downward through the condensation, not outside, inside the glass. I was driving through eastern Nevada in late August when this happened. I'd been on Route 50 for hours with almost no other cars around. It was one of those dry nights where the heat stayed trapped over the road even after dark. My AC barely worked, so I had the windows cracked most of the drive. I remember the moon was really low and orange looking near the mountains. Everything else was black. Around midnight, I started getting tired enough that I decided to pull over somewhere for coffee or just to stretch my legs. My phone had no signal for almost 40 minutes by then, and the GPS map wouldn't load properly anymore. I figured eventually I'd hit a gas station. Instead, I found this abandoned service station sitting alone off the highway. Not old enough to look historic or anything, just dead. 2 pumps under a sagging awning, garage bays with faded lettering, gravel lot half covered in weeds. 1 vending machine tipped over beside the building. The place looked shut down for years. I almost kept driving, but my headlights caught the old Coke machine outside, and for some reason that made the stop feel less creepy. More normal. So I pulled in. The second my tires hit the gravel, I noticed something weird above the building. At first I thought it was a reflection from my windshield. There was this metallic-looking shape hanging over the roofline. Not moving, just catching my headlights at a strange angle. It looked smooth, silver maybe. Hard to judge size because of the darkness. My first thought was water tower, then weather balloon, then maybe part of the station sign twisted around somehow. But the reflection was too clean looking, too bright. I slowed the car almost to a stop and stared through the windshield trying to understand what I was seeing. Then the reflection disappeared completely. Not faded, just gone, like somebody switched it off. I actually laughed a little because it freaked me out so suddenly. I told myself it was probably just glare bouncing off something. Still, I kept looking toward the roof while parking near the pumps. The station sat completely silent. No insects. No highway noise anymore either, somehow, even though the road was maybe 200 feet away. When I turned my engine off, the silence felt unusually heavy. I stepped out of the car. The heat hit me immediately, but underneath it there was another smell in the air. Not gasoline exactly. Electrical, like hot wires or a power strip burning out. The smell wasn't strong, but it was noticeable enough that I checked around the pumps, thinking maybe exposed wiring was nearby. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight from the passenger seat and walked a little closer to the building. The gravel crunched loudly under my shoes. That was the only sound. The garage windows were blacked out with dirt inside. One of the service bay doors hung halfway open. I could see darkness beyond it, but nothing else. The electrical smell stayed in the air the whole time. I kept glancing back above the roofline, trying to see the reflection again. Nothing. I remember feeling stupid for being nervous. It was just an abandoned building in the desert. Probably coyotes nearby or something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed when I pulled in. Like, I interrupted something. I walked around the side of the station with my flashlight and found old tires stacked against the wall. Broken glass everywhere. Somebody had spray painted over the windows years ago. Then, I noticed the back lot. There were tracks in the dirt behind the building. Not tire tracks. Long, dragged lines crossing the gravel toward the desert behind the station. At first, I thought maybe pipes had been pulled back there at some point, but the marks looked fresh compared to everything else. I crouched down with the flashlight. The dirt around them looked disturbed recently, like something heavy had scraped across it. That's when I heard the hum. Very low. I actually thought it was inside my ears at first. Not mechanical exactly, more like distant power lines. I stood up slowly and looked around. The hum got slightly louder, then stopped. The electrical smell became stronger for maybe 2 seconds before fading again. I remember backing toward my car without really deciding to. Halfway there, I looked up. Something was above the station again. Not directly overhead, higher this time. I could only see part of it because there was almost no light except my headlights and the moon, but something reflective caught the beam again for a split second. Smooth metal, curved maybe. Then it shifted sideways soundlessly and vanished into the dark sky. No acceleration, no dramatic movement. It just blended away somehow. I stood frozen beside my car, staring upward. The desert around me suddenly felt enormous. I got inside immediately and locked the doors. For a minute, I considered leaving right then, but I kept thinking maybe exhaustion was messing with me. I'd been driving too long already. I drank some water and sat there trying to calm down. That's when the radio turned on by itself. Not loudly, just a burst of static. I jumped so hard I hit my knee on the steering wheel. The screen lit up for maybe 3 seconds, even though the car was completely off. Static crackled through the speakers. Then I heard what sounded like part of a voice. Not words exactly. More like somebody speaking too far away to understand. Then silence again. The radio shut off. I started the car immediately after that. The engine struggled for a second before turning over. My headlights dimmed briefly. Then everything came back normal. I pulled toward the highway exit of the lot, but before reaching the road, I stopped again without meaning to. There was somebody standing near the service bays. At least I thought it was somebody. Tall, thin, completely still. Too dark to make out details. I stared at it through the windshield, waiting for movement. None came. I flashed my high beams once. Nothing happened. Then slowly the figure stepped backward into the open garage bay and disappeared to the darkness inside. Not rushed, just smooth and calm. I drove out onto the highway immediately after that. For the next 15 minutes, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting headlights behind me. There were none. The weird thing was the electrical smell stayed inside my car long after I left the station. I even checked under the dashboard at one point because I thought something might actually be overheating. But everything looked fine. Eventually, I noticed another strange thing. The clock on my dashboard said 1:42 a.m. I knew that couldn't be right. When I pulled into the station, it had been around midnight, maybe a little after. I checked my phone, 1:41. I actually pulled onto the shoulder because I became convinced both clocks were wrong somehow. I went through my recent calls and texts trying to piece together the timeline. The last text I'd sent was at 11:18 p.m. from Ely. That service station couldn't have been more than 40 minutes down the highway, even driving slowly. I sat there on the shoulder with trucks occasionally passing in the distance trying to figure out where the extra hour had gone. I honestly thought maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel earlier without realizing it. That scared me more than the light did. So, I stayed awake the rest of the drive by blasting cold air and stopping every 20 minutes. Around 3 in the morning, I finally reached a small motel outside Fallon. The woman working the front desk looked half asleep. While checking in, she glanced outside toward my car and asked if one of my headlights had gone out during the drive. I said I didn't think so. She pointed toward the parking lot. The entire passenger side of my car was coated in this fine gray dust. Not dirt from the road, more like ash almost. There were streaks through it where my fingers brushed against the door handle. Even stranger, the passenger side windows had tiny circular marks all over them. Hundreds of them. Like condensation spots. I rubbed one with my thumb. It wouldn't come off. That night I barely slept. Around sunrise, I finally went outside to inspect the car better. The dust had mostly blown off already in the wind, but the circular marks remained. And on the roof above the passenger seat there were 3 shallow dents in the metal, perfectly round, like somebody had pressed hard with giant fingertips. I worked one harvest season at an apple orchard outside Wenatchee when this happened. The owner hired extra workers every fall because the trees stretched across several hillsides and there was never enough time to finish before weather turned bad. Most evenings we stopped picking before dark, but during the last week of harvest we stayed later trying to beat incoming rain. This happened near the end of October. Cold dusk, thin fog hanging low between the rows. The sky looked heavy and gray even before sunset disappeared behind the hills. By around 6 p.m., most of the crew had already headed back toward the packing sheds, but I stayed behind finishing one last section near the far end of the orchard. That part sat farther from the main road and bordered open fields on one side with pine forest beyond them. I remember how quiet it got after everybody left. No tractors running, no voices. Just distant wind moving through branches and the occasional clink of apples dropping into my picking bag. The orchard rows stretched forever in the fading light. I climbed a ladder beside one of the older trees and kept working while dusk settled in around me. That's when I noticed the glow. At first I thought headlights shone through the trees from the highway miles away, a pale white light hanging above the far end of the orchard. But after another few seconds I realized it wasn't moving. It hovered maybe 30 or 40 feet above the trees near the edge of the fields, soft white. Not bright enough to fully light the orchard, just enough that I could see faint reflection off wet leaves beneath it. I stopped picking and stared at it for a while. No engine noise, no helicopter sound, nothing. The wind continued moving branches around me normally. Then came the vibration. At first I thought distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills, a low pulse traveling faintly through the aluminum ladder beneath my boots. Whum! The ladder trembled lightly against the tree trunk. Several seconds later again. Whum! The glow brightened slightly during each pulse. I climbed down slowly without taking my eyes off it. The pale light remained perfectly still above the orchard rows. Fog drifted beneath it strangely too. Instead of moving with the wind, it curled upward toward the glow in slow spirals. Hum! The vibration deepened. Loose apples in the picking bin beside me rattled softly together during the pulse. I remember checking my phone automatically. No signal. Battery at 4% even though it had been over half full earlier. The screen dimmed almost immediately. Then the birds exploded from the trees. Every bird in the orchard took off at once, hundreds of wings suddenly crashing through branches around me, black shapes filling the fading sky above the rows. It happened so abruptly I nearly dropped the phone. The birds scattered hard toward the hills, and then silence followed. Complete silence. No wind, no branches moving, nothing. Even the leaves overhead stopped rustling. The entire orchard felt frozen. Whum. The pulse came stronger. This time I felt it in my chest more than through the ladder. The glow above the far rows brightened further, and the fog beneath it spread low between the trees like smoke rolling along the ground. I remember backing slowly away from the ladder then. The silence felt physically wrong somehow. Too complete. I could still see branches swaying farther off from the evening wind, but there was absolutely no sound attached to them anymore. Whum. The vibration spread faintly through the ground beneath my boots. Apples hanging from nearby branches trembled slightly during the pulse. The glow drifted lower toward the orchard rows. Still perfectly smooth motion. Still silent. And beneath it, the tops of the trees bent downward slightly as if heavy pressure pushed from above. That's when I noticed movement deeper between the rows ahead. Dark shapes standing motionless beneath the branches. At first, I thought maybe other workers still out there, but they were too tall, too narrow, and they didn't move naturally. I remember trying to convince myself they were tree trunks disappearing into the fog. Then, one shifted position slightly without any visible walking. The humming became continuous now. The vibration filled the orchard around me. My ears hurt sharply from pressure building inside them. The glow drifted closer. Near enough now that pale light reflected off wet apples hanging around me. And the ground beneath the trees looked strangely flat and washed out beneath it. I started walking back toward the equipment road between the rows. Not running yet. Just wanting distance from whatever I was seeing. Whum! The continuous vibration deepened harder. The aluminum ladder beside the tree rattled faintly by itself. The picking bins trembled against the dirt, and every shadow between the orchard rows suddenly looked deeper than before. Then something moved behind me. Not fast, just careful shifting through branches somewhere nearby. I turned immediately. Nothing visible except fog drifting low between the trees, but the glow had moved again. Closer now, too close. I remember realizing then how isolated that end of the orchard actually was. No nearby workers, no machinery, no house lights visible through the fog, just rows of dark trees disappearing into silence. Then all the orchard lights in the distance flickered. Small yellow work lamps near the packing sheds flashed weakly once. At the exact same moment, the glow brightened hard enough that the entire far end of the orchard reflected pale white. And during that brightness, I saw several tall silhouettes standing motionless between the trees ahead of me. Not clear enough to describe beyond that, just dark shapes facing my direction. Then the silence shattered. Wind rushed violently through the orchard again. Branches rattled overhead. Somewhere far off, a tractor engine started up. The sudden noise startled me hard enough I stumbled sideways into the ladder. The glow remained hovering above the orchard maybe another 10 seconds. Then it rose silently upward into the low clouds and disappeared completely. Gone. The trees immediately returned to normal movement in the wind. Everything looked ordinary again. I stood there breathing hard for probably another minute, before finally grabbing my things and walking back toward the sheds. Halfway there, I checked the time on my phone. 7:42 p.m. That made no sense. The last time I checked it had been shortly after 6. Nearly an hour missing. The strangest part happened when I got back to the equipment barn. One of the other workers looked at my boots and asked where I'd been walking. At first, I didn't understand what he meant. Then I looked down. My boots were coated in wet gray mud, nearly to the knees. But the orchard rows had been dry all evening except near the irrigation ditch, almost half a mile from where I'd been picking. And mixed into the mud were crushed white feathers stuck all over the laces and soles. I farmed alfalfa with my older brother outside Twin Falls for a few years before selling my share and moving away. Most mornings during irrigation season started before sunrise because somebody had to drive out and check the canal gates before water levels changed. The canals ran for miles through open fields out there, concrete channels cutting between farms, with old dirt access roads beside them. During summer, the water moved fast enough you could hear it long before you saw it. This happened in early May. Cold morning. Not freezing, but cold enough that fog sat low across the fields before sunrise. Wind blowing steady from the west, moving the crops in long waves under the dark sky. I left the farmhouse around 4 a.m. in my truck with coffee and a thermos and drove toward the south irrigation gate about 2 miles out. The roads were empty except for occasional tractors parked beside fields. I remember the wind being loud that morning. It pushed against the truck hard enough that the mirrors rattled sometimes. The canal water looked rough too where I first passed it. Small ripples and choppy reflections from the breeze. Everything felt normal. I checked the first gate without problems, then drove farther south toward another section where the canal curved around a line of cottonwood trees. That's where I noticed the glow. At first, I thought headlights reflected off the water from another farm road, a pale white light sliding slowly along the canal surface ahead of me. But as I got closer, I realized the road beside the canal was completely empty. No vehicles, no machinery, nothing. The glow kept moving anyway. Soft white reflection gliding low across the water, not above it, on it. I slowed the truck almost immediately. The strangest part was the water beneath the glow. Everywhere else, the canal rippled hard from the wind. But directly beneath the pale light, the surface stayed perfectly smooth, flat like glass. The smooth section moved together with the glow, while the surrounding canal water chopped and shifted normally. I remember rolling the truck window down slightly despite the cold. At first, I thought maybe some electrical equipment nearby caused reflex on the water, but there were no pumps running, no power poles close enough, only open fields in the canal disappearing into fog ahead. Then came the humming, low, barely audible over the wind. Whump! I felt it faintly through the truck door more than heard it. Several seconds later again, whump! The glow brightened slightly during each pulse, and the smooth patch of canal water widened outward around it. I pulled the truck onto the dirt access road beside the canal and stopped. The glow drifted slowly farther down the waterway away from me. Still perfectly silent, still hovering just above the surface, maybe a foot or two. The wind continued moving the grass along the banks, but the canal directly beneath the glow remained unnaturally calm. Whum! The vibration deepened slightly. Loose tools on the passenger seat rattled softly during the pulse. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck. Cold wind hit immediately. Except near the canal, something felt wrong. The air around the glow seemed strangely still compared to the surrounding fields. Fog drifted low over the water there, curling slowly upward beneath the pale light. I walked closer along the canal bank. Mud sucked at my boots from rain earlier that week. The glow continued, moving ahead of me at almost walking speed. Then I noticed the usual sounds fading. The wind through the grass softened first. Then distant irrigation pumps somewhere across the fields disappeared too. Within another minute, the entire area felt muted somehow. Whomp! The pulse came stronger. The pressure inside my ears shifted painfully for a second. The glow brightened enough now that wet concrete canal walls reflected pale white through the fog. I remember checking my phone automatically. No signal. Battery at 1% despite charging it overnight. The screen dimmed almost black before locking itself. Whum! The vibrations spread through the ground beneath my boots during that pulse, and the canal water beyond the glow began changing too. Not fully smooth, just moving strangely. Small, perfectly circular ripples spreading outward against the normal current. The glow drifted farther beneath the cottonwood trees ahead, and for a second I thought I saw movement on the opposite bank. Tall, narrow shapes standing motionless between the trunks, not detailed enough to identify, just darker than the fog around them. I stopped walking immediately. The glow stopped too, hovering silently above the canal. The water beneath it remained perfectly still. Then all sound vanished. No wind, no moving water, nothing. The silence felt heavy enough that my chest tightened. I could still see grass bending in the distance from wind gusts across the fields, but there was absolutely no sound attached to it anymore. Only the humming remained. Whum, continuous now. The vibration inside my ears became almost physical pressure. The glow brightened slightly. Fog beneath the trees rotated upward in slow spirals around it. and the canal water nearest me began trembling faintly without making ripples. I remember taking a step backward then. The mud beneath my boots felt strangely soft, almost warm. The glow drifted slowly toward my side of the canal, still smooth motion, still no visible source inside it. And during one pulse, I thought I saw reflections moving across the water that didn't match anything above. Dark shapes sliding silently beneath the glow inside the canal itself. Then something splashed softly behind me, not loud, just enough to make me spin around. Nothing there except my truck parked beside the access road. The headlights reflected dimly through fog now, but when I turned back toward the canal, the glow was closer than before, near enough that pale white reflected across wet mud along the bank. And for 1 second I thought I saw several dark figures standing farther down the canal road near the truck, completely still. Then all the sound returned violently, wind roaring across the fields again, water rushing loudly through the canal, tree branches rattling overhead. The sudden noise made me stumble sideways hard enough that one boot slipped into the mud near the canal edge. The glow remained visible, maybe another few seconds. Then it drifted silently farther down the canal beneath the fog and disappeared completely. Gone. The water immediately returned to normal rough ripples beneath the wind. Everything looked ordinary again. I stood there breathing hard, staring into empty fog for at least another minute before walking back toward the truck. That's when I realized something felt wrong with the time. The eastern sky already looked lighter than before. Not sunrise exactly, but close. I checked my watch. 5:32 a.m. Nearly an hour gone. I couldn't remember most of that time near the canal at all. The weirdest part happened once I reached the truck. Wet footprints circled the driver's side in the mud. Not mine. My boots had deep, square treads. These looked narrow and smooth, almost barefoot-shaped except too long. And there were more of them than should have been possible around that little stretch of road. They stopped several feet from the canal bank. No tracks leading toward the water. No tracks leading away into the fields. Just damp prints surrounding the truck doors in the mud as if someone had stood there silently while I watched the canal. I worked one fire season in a lookout tower in western Montana. Temporary job. Mostly sitting alone on a mountain scanning for smoke and calling in lightning strikes during dry months. The tower stood on top of a ridge miles from the nearest paved road. Just a narrow, dirt access trail winding through pine forest and cliffs. Once you were up there overnight, the isolation hit hard. The tower itself was old too. Wooden supports, tiny living quarters, windows on all four sides, an ancient radio setup bolted beside the desk that crackled constantly, even during good weather. By late September, most of the other seasonal workers had already left. I stayed a few extra weeks because storms kept rolling through, and they still needed someone monitoring lightning activity. This happened during my second to last week there. The weather had turned ugly that afternoon. Cold rain, heavy cloud cover, strong wind hitting the tower hard enough, the whole structure creaked every few minutes. By around 11 p.m., visibility dropped badly. Clouds sat low over the mountains, and fog moved through the trees beneath the tower in thick waves. I remember making coffee and listening to weather updates on the radio while rain hammered the windows. Everything felt normal at first. The wind was loud enough that branches snapped occasionally somewhere below the ridge. The tower groaned constantly. The old radio hissed with weak static between weather broadcasts. Then the pulsing tones started. At first I thought interference caught in the radio, a low electronic tone buried beneath the static. Whum. Pause. Whum. It repeated every several seconds. The sound felt strangely deep for the little speaker mounted beside the desk. I adjusted the frequency, thinking maybe another ranger station transmitted nearby. Nothing changed. The tone continued. Whum. The tower windows rattled slightly during each pulse. That's when I noticed the light. At first it looked like distant lightning reflecting through fog below the clouds. A pale white glow hanging somewhere off the western side of the ridge, but lightning flashes disappear. This stayed there, perfectly still beneath the cloud layer. I stood up and walked toward the windows. The glow hovered maybe several hundred yards away over the forested slope below the tower, not above the clouds, inside them. Soft, white, oval-shaped light suspended in the storm. The wind outside remained violent. Trees bent hard below the ridge. Fog tore sideways through the valleys. Yet the glow didn't move at all, not even slightly. Whump! The tone from the radio deepened during the pulse, and the light brightened faintly at the exact same moment. That's when I started paying real attention. I grabbed binoculars from the desk and looked toward the glow. Couldn't focus properly. The fog around it blurred strangely. Everywhere else, the mountains looked sharp enough between cloud breaks. Only the glow refused to come into focus. Whum! The tower vibrated faintly during the pulse. Coffee rippled inside the mug beside me. I remember checking the weather radar on my laptop then. No signal. Internet dead. Not unusual during storms up there, but still. The radio crackled again. Whum! Static. Whum! Almost rhythmic now. Outside, the glow remained fixed beneath the clouds despite heavy wind blowing rain sideways across the ridge. That's what bothered me most. Everything else moved violently in the storm except that light. Then the forest sound started fading. The wind still looked strong through the windows, but somehow sounded quieter. The rain softened too. Within another minute, the only clear sound left inside the tower was the pulsing tone from the radio. Hum! Hum! The glow brightened slightly during each pulse, and the fog beneath it curled upward in slow spirals against the storm winds. I remember feeling pressure building in my ears then, like rapid elevation change driving through mountains. I swallowed several times trying to clear it. Didn't help. The tone from the radio deepened further. Whum! The old metal desk lamp beside the radio flickered weakly. Then the tower lights dimmed. Not completely. Just enough that the room washed pale gray. The glow outside reflected faintly across the wet windows during that pulse. And for 1 second, I thought I saw something darker moving beneath it inside the fog. Tall, narrow shapes crossing slowly through the trees on the slope below. Gone immediately when lightning flashed farther off behind the mountains. I remember gripping the windowsill harder, trying to convince myself it was just trees moving in fog. Then all the storm noise vanished. Instant silence. No rain, no wind, nothing. The silence hit hard enough, my chest tightened. I could still see trees bending violently outside through the windows, but there was absolutely no sound attached to it. Only the pulsing tone from the radio remained. Whum! Whum! The radio speaker vibrated visibly during each pulse now. The glow outside drifted slightly closer toward the tower, still perfectly still relative to the wind somehow, still suspended below the clouds. The fog around it rotated slowly upward like smoke around a vent. Then something strange happened with the tower itself. The floor beneath my boots vibrated faintly, not shaking from wind, more controlled than that. Steady vibration rising through the supports underneath. Whum! The pulse hit stronger. Several loose pencils rolled slowly across the desk by themselves. The hanging lantern near the bunk swayed slightly, even though the tower windows remained shut. Outside, the glow brightened enough that the tops of nearby trees reflected pale white through the fog. And beneath it, I thought I saw movement again. Dark shapes standing motionless among the trees below the ridge. Too tall, too thin. Then the radio changed. The pulsing tone stopped briefly. And for maybe 2 seconds, another sound came through the speaker underneath heavy static. Not voices exactly, more like layered breathing or distant humming overlapping together. I froze, completely listening. Then the pulsing returned louder than before. Whum! Whum! The pressure in my ears became painful. The glow outside drifted higher toward the tower level. Near enough now that pale white reflected across the glass windows surrounding the lookout. I remember becoming intensely aware that I was completely alone up there, miles from anyone. No nearby roads, no lights anywhere except that thing suspended in the storm. Then lightning flashed somewhere behind the clouds, and during that brief flash, I saw several dark vertical shapes standing at the tree line directly below the tower, motionless, facing upward. The storm sound slammed back immediately afterward, wind roaring through the ridge, rain hammering the windows, branches cracking somewhere below. The sudden noise startled me hard enough I stumbled backward into the desk. The radio tone continued maybe another 10 seconds. Then the glow outside rose silently into the clouds and disappeared completely. Gone. At the exact same moment, the radio fell dead silent except for normal static. No pulsing, no humming, nothing unusual at all. I stood there breathing hard, staring into black storm clouds where the light had been. Then I noticed the clock on the radio console. 2:17 a.m. I checked my watch automatically. 11:58 p.m. Completely stopped. The second hand frozen between ticks. The strangest part happened the next morning. After the storm passed, I climbed down the tower to inspect for damage before sunrise. The ground around the base of the lookout looked soaked from rain everywhere, except one section facing the western slope. There, the wet pine needles formed a wide, pale ring around the supports, perfectly dry inside the circle while everything else remained muddy and drenched. I worked maintenance at a cemetery outside Asheville for about 8 months after getting laid off from another job, mostly mowing, trimming branches, digging marker foundations, and locking the gates after visitors left. The cemetery sat outside town near a wooded hillside with old pine and maple trees surrounding most of the property. Past the back fence, there wasn't much except thick forest stretching into state land. I usually worked evenings alone because the older groundskeeper hated staying after dark. This happened in late September. Warm night after rain earlier in the day. Everything smelled damp and earthy. Fog sat low between the headstones while the last light faded behind the trees. By around 7:30 p.m., I'd finished putting equipment away and started driving the small utility cart around, checking the gates before locking up. The cemetery got very quiet after sunset. Not scary exactly, just isolated. You'd hear insects constantly out there though. Crickets, cicadas, tree frogs near the drainage ditch. That kind of thing. I remember the noise being especially loud that evening because the air stayed warm after the rain. I locked the east gate first, then drove toward the rear boundary near the tree line. That part of the cemetery always felt different. Older graves, fewer lights. The woods pressed right up against the back fence there. I got out near the final gate carrying my flashlight and key ring. That's when I noticed the glow. At first I thought somebody walked through the woods with a lantern or flashlight. A soft, pale light drifting slowly between the distant trees beyond the cemetery boundary. But something about it looked wrong immediately. The glow never actually shone through the branches. It illuminated around them somehow without breaking between the trunks, like fog glowing from inside. I stood there watching for a minute. The light moved slowly deeper through the woods parallel to the fence line. No crunching leaves, no voices, nothing. Then came the humming, low, barely audible beneath the insects. Whump! I felt it faintly through the metal gate beside me. Several seconds later again. Whump! The glow brightened slightly during each pulse. I remember raising the flashlight toward the woods instinctively, but the beam barely reached the trees beyond the fence. The pale glow remained farther back, moving slowly between the trunks. Still no visible source. Whump! The vibration deepened slightly. Keys hanging from my belt rattled softly during the pulse, and then every insect sound stopped. All at once. No fading, no gradual quiet, just complete silence. The sudden absence hit hard enough I froze immediately. 1 second, the woods buzzed with noise. The next second, nothing. No crickets, no frogs, no wind, nothing. I could still see branches moving slightly from the breeze, but there was absolutely no sound attached to them anymore. Whump! The glow drifted closer to the cemetery boundary. Still hidden among the trees, still never fully visible through the branches. And the pressure inside my ears shifted painfully during the pulse. I remember swallowing several times trying to clear them. The gate latch beneath my hand vibrated faintly. The entire cemetery suddenly felt much larger and emptier than before. Rows of wet headstones disappearing into fog, dark trees surrounding everything. No nearby traffic anymore. No distant town noise, only the low humming. Continuous now. The vibration spread through the ground faintly beneath my boots. The pale glow moved steadily along the tree line beyond the fence. And for 1 second I thought I saw shapes standing motionless deeper among the woods around it. Tall, narrow silhouettes partially hidden between trunks. Gone immediately afterward. I backed away from the fence automatically then. The glow stopped moving, hovering motionless somewhere behind the trees. And the fog inside the cemetery began drifting strangely toward the back fence despite the wind blowing another direction. Whum! The pressure in my ears deepened hard enough that my jaw hurt. The glow brightened further. Nearby gravestones reflected faint, pale white across their wet surfaces, and during one pulse, I thought I saw movement among the graves behind me. Not fast, just dark figures standing farther down the rows than before. I turned immediately. Nothing there except fog and headstones, but when I looked back toward the woods, the glow seemed closer. Near enough now that the outer fence reflected dull white along the wire. The silence remained absolute. No insects anywhere. Then the utility cart behind me flickered. Its headlights dimmed briefly before brightening again. Whum! The humming deepened hard enough that the gate chain rattled softly, and for 1 second the trees beyond the fence lit pale enough that I saw several tall shapes standing completely still among them facing the cemetery, not detailed enough to identify, just darker than the woods around them. Then something moved near the graves to my left. I heard it that time, a soft scrape across wet grass. I turned the flashlight fast enough that my wrist hurt, nothing visible, but the beam caught fog swirling low around several headstones, maybe 20 yards away. And in the middle of the fog stood a shadow darker than everything around it, for maybe 1 second before disappearing. Hum! The pressure inside my head became almost unbearable. The glow beyond the trees remained fixed. The fog inside the cemetery thickened further. And every reflective surface around me, wet stone, metal fences, puddles on the road, started catching faint, pale white light. Then all sound returned violently. Crickets exploding across the grass, tree frogs shrieking from the ditch, wind rushing hard through branches overhead. The sudden noise startled me badly enough I stumbled backward into the utility cart. At the same moment, the glow beyond the cemetery boundary drifted silently deeper into the woods and disappeared completely. Gone. The trees looked normal again. Dark, empty, no unusual light anywhere. I stood there breathing hard for probably another minute before realizing my flashlight had gone out. Not dead exactly, just unresponsive. I smacked it twice before it flickered back on weakly. That's when I noticed the time. My phone showed 8:26 p.m., nearly 40 minutes gone. I couldn't account for most of it. The strangest part happened while locking the final gate before leaving. Mud streaked across the back of my work shirt like someone had dragged wet fingers downward across the fabric, and mixed into the mud were tiny pine needles from the woods beyond the cemetery fence, even though I never stepped past the gate that night. My brother-in-law's cabin sat above Dillon Reservoir in Colorado, not right on the water, but close enough that you could walk down through the pines in 10 minutes if the snow wasn't too deep. It was February, the kind of cold that made car doors stick and made your nose hurt when you breathed too fast. I was there by myself for 3 nights because I'd needed somewhere quiet to work. My sister and her husband used the place mostly in summer, and he'd told me the heater worked fine, as long as I kept the wood stove going in the evenings. He also warned me not to mess around on the reservoir unless I knew the ice was safe. I didn't plan to. On the second afternoon, I walked into town for groceries and coffee. The sky had been gray all morning, but the snow held off. By the time I started back, it was already getting dark in that early winter way where everything turns blue before you're ready for it. I took the road halfway, then cut down toward the reservoir because it was shorter. I'd seen other people walking across the ice earlier that day. There were ski tracks, boot prints, even a couple of snowmobile trails crossing from one side to the other. It didn't seem reckless at the time. The ice looked solid, covered in packed snow, except for places where the wind had scraped it bare and left cloudy gray patches. I could see lights from houses on the far shore. The cabin was up in the trees beyond them. It was quiet enough that I heard my coat rubbing when I walked. I had a backpack with groceries, 1 paper cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and my phone at about 20%. I remember thinking I should have brought gloves with better grip because the snow crust kept sliding under my boots. I was maybe a quarter of the way across when I noticed the glow. At first, I thought it was a reflection from one of the houses. It sat under the ice several yards to my left, maybe 15 or 20 feet away. Soft, yellow-white, not bright, not flashing. More like a flashlight wrapped in cloth. I stopped and looked around for someone nearby. Nobody. The shore behind me was empty. The shore ahead had a few cabin lights, but they were too far and too high to be reflecting like that. The glow stayed under the ice, That was the part that made me stand there longer than I should have. It wasn't on top of the snow. It wasn't bouncing across the surface. It seemed to be below the ice, down inside the darker water, but close enough that it lit up the cracks around it. I took one step closer, then stopped because the ice gave a low pop under my boot. Not a break, just one of those deep sounds frozen lakes make. Still, it went through my whole body. The glow moved, slowly. It slid beneath the ice from left to right without stirring anything. No water movement, no bubbles, no cracking. It just moved like something was gliding under a pane of frosted glass. I told myself it had to be a fish. Then I realized fish don't glow like lanterns. I started walking again, faster than before. The glow kept pace, not exactly beside me, but close enough. If I stopped, it stopped a few seconds later. If I moved, it drifted along under the ice at that same slow speed. I looked back toward the town side and almost turned around. Then I noticed something else. The sound of the reservoir had changed. Before, I could hear faint traffic from the highway and wind in the trees. Now everything sounded muffled. My boots still crunched, but even that sounded wrong, like the noise was happening inside a room with thick walls. I pulled my phone out to record it. The screen was black. I held the power button down and nothing happened. Battery dead, I guess, even though it had been at 20% maybe 10 minutes earlier. That was the first time I really felt alone. Not scared like panic yet. More like I had walked too far from the regular world and only noticed after it was too late. I put the phone back in my pocket and kept moving toward the far shore. The glow drifted closer. I could see it better now through one of the bare patches of ice. It looked round at first, but as it moved under clearer ice, the shape changed. It stretched into something longer, then became round again, like I wasn't seeing the thing itself, but light passing through something uneven. The color wasn't quite white either. It had a pale green edge to it. Very faint. My coffee cup slipped from my hand and bounced once on the snow. I didn't pick it up. A few seconds later, I heard a knocking sound from underneath the ice. 3 soft taps, then a pause, then 2 more. I stopped so fast I nearly fell. The glow stopped too. I stood there holding my breath, looking down. The ice beneath my boots looked thick, foggy, full of white lines and trapped air. Then the knocking came again, this time from farther ahead. Tap, tap, tap. It didn't sound like cracking. It sounded deliberate, like someone hitting the underside of a table with one finger. I said, "Hello?" I don't know why. My voice came out flat and tiny. Nothing answered. The glow moved again, but this time it passed in front of me instead of beside me. It crossed my path several yards ahead, then turned slowly back toward the direction I needed to go, like it wanted me to follow. I almost turned around right there, but the town shore looked farther away now than it should have. The trees behind it blended into the dark, and the footprints I'd made seemed faint already, partly covered by wind-blown powder. The far shore had porch lights and cabins and the road up to my brother-in-law's place. So I kept going. I tried not to look at the glow after that, but I kept seeing it from the corner of my eye. It stayed close. Sometimes it sank deeper and became blurry. Sometimes it rose near the surface, and the ice around it lit up enough for me to see long cracks spreading beneath my feet. About halfway across, the wind stopped completely. I noticed because my face suddenly felt warmer. The cold was still there, but the air wasn't moving at all. Even the loose snow on the ice stopped skittering. Then I smelled something strange. Not rotten, not gasoline, more like wet pennies and burned dust. It came in one steady wave and sat there around me. I looked toward the far shore and saw a man standing near the tree line. At least I thought it was a man. He was on the ice, maybe 20 yards from shore, wearing dark clothes, too far away to see his face. He stood perfectly still with his arms at his sides. For a second, I felt relief because it meant I wasn't alone. I raised one hand. He didn't wave back. I called out, "Hey, is the ice okay over there?" He didn't move. The glow under the ice slowed down. The smell got stronger. I started walking toward the shore, but angled away from the man. I didn't like the way he stood there. It was too still, and he wasn't dressed right for the cold. No hat that I could see. No visible breath either, though mine was coming out in thick clouds. When I got closer, I realized he wasn't on the ice. He was standing just beyond the shore in the trees. Except the tree line behind him looked wrong. The trunks near him didn't line up right. There was a darker area behind his body, like the woods had a gap in them where no snow caught the light. I blinked hard, and the shape changed. Not moved, changed. It became just a narrow tree trunk with branches behind it. That made me feel worse. I had been so sure it was a person that my stomach turned when it wasn't. The glow beneath the ice brightened. I looked down, and for 1 second I saw another light farther out behind it. Then another. 3 lights under the ice, spaced apart in a line, all of them moving slowly in my direction. That was when I started jogging. I knew running on ice was stupid, but I couldn't help it. My boots slipped and scraped, the backpack bounced against my shoulders. I kept expecting the ice to crack under me, or for one of those lights to shoot ahead and cut me off. They didn't. They just followed, slow and steady. The knocking came back, louder now, moving beneath me from left to right. Not random. It had rhythm. 3 taps, 2 taps, 3 taps. My ears started ringing. A high, thin sound, like an old television turned on in another room. The far shore looked close, then far, then close again. I don't know how else to explain it. I could see the snowbank clearly. Then a moment later, it seemed like I hadn't gained any ground at all. I kept picking a porch light and walking toward it, but the distance didn't shrink the way it should have. I checked my watch. It was an old digital Casio, nothing fancy. The numbers showed 5:28. That made no sense. It had been around 4:45 when I left town. The crossing should have taken maybe 20 minutes, not 40, and it still wasn't over. I looked up again. The cabin lights on shore were gone. Not all lights, just the ones I'd been aiming for. The shore was a dark strip now, trees packed together, snowbanks pale beneath them. I could still see the outline of land, but no houses. No road. No warm windows. The only light came from under the ice. I stopped jogging because I couldn't catch my breath. The ringing in my ears grew louder. My jaw ached. My teeth buzzed like I'd bitten foil. Then the glow moved directly beneath me. I froze. The ice under my boots turned milky white, then pale green, then white again. The light spread around both feet in a wide circle. It was brighter than before, but still soft, like it didn't belong to a bulb or flame. Something shifted under the surface. I couldn't see a body, not clearly. Just a darker shape inside the glow, broad and smooth, passing under the ice. The ice didn't crack. That was almost worse. A thing that size should have pushed water, scraped the underside, made bubbles, anything. It moved without touching the world around it. The smell became so strong my eyes watered. I tried to step away, but my left boot wouldn't lift. I looked down and saw nothing holding it. No crack, no slush, no strap caught on anything. It just would not move. My right boot moved fine. I tugged harder, and the sole made a rubber squeak against the ice. The knocking stopped. Everything stopped. Then I heard my name. Not loud. Not from above. From under the ice. Mark. It sounded like my own voice played through a cheap speaker. I pulled so hard my foot came free and I fell backward onto the ice. Pain shot through my elbow. Groceries shifted in my backpack and something glass broke. I scrambled up, slipped twice, and kept going toward shore without looking down. I don't know how long I moved like that. A minute, maybe 10. The next thing I clearly remembered. I was on my hands and knees in snow near the bank, coughing so hard I thought I might throw up. The reservoir was behind me. The glow was still out there under the ice, several yards away from shore. It sat still now. Watching felt like the wrong word, but that was what it felt like. I got to my feet and stumbled up through the trees toward the road. When I looked back once, the glow faded, abruptly. No dimming, no drifting away. Just gone. The wind came back so suddenly that loose snow blew off branches around me. I could hear cars again on the highway. A dog barked somewhere near the cabins. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen lit up. 34% battery. I had 3 missed calls from my sister, which made no sense because she was in Denver and didn't know I'd gone walking. I called her back right there with shaking hands. She answered half asleep and irritated, asking why I'd called her 4 times and said nothing. I told her I hadn't. She said my number had called her at 5:12, 5:19, 5:10, 5:26, and 5:31. Each time she answered, there was only static and what sounded like wind. I looked at my watch. 5:34. It was fully dark now. That was impossible too. The crossing couldn't have taken that long. It should have been maybe 1 hour from leaving town to reaching the cabin, even walking slowly. I followed the road uphill and made it back to the cabin around 6. The first thing I did was lock the door, which felt stupid because whatever had happened was outside on the reservoir, not in the trees. Still, I locked it and pushed one of the kitchen chairs under the handle. Then I turned on every light. My backpack smelled terrible, like metal and lake water. The jar of pasta sauce inside had cracked, but nothing else was wet, and there was no red sauce leaking anywhere. The broken jar was empty, clean inside, like someone had washed it. My left boot had a pale mark across the sole. Not mud, not ice. A chalky white streak that looked burned into the rubber. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, listening to the heater click on and off. Around 7, my brother-in-law called. His name was Joel, and he'd been checking the cabin cameras because my sister told him I'd sounded weird. He asked if I'd gone across the reservoir. I said yes. He got quiet, then told me the camera above the garage showed me coming up the road at 5:58, but there was something strange about the footage. I asked what he meant. He said the motion light never came on until I was almost at the porch. That light picked up deer from 30 feet away. But in the video, I walked up the driveway in total darkness until I was almost touching the steps. Then the light clicked on and I appeared all at once, like the camera had missed the first half of me crossing the yard. I told him maybe the camera lagged. He said maybe. Then he asked why I was carrying my backpack in front of me. I looked at the backpack on the floor beside the table. I had no memory of doing that. Joel sent me the clip later, but I only watched it once. The quality wasn't great. Snow blew across the frame. The driveway sat dark, then the porch light snapped on. I was standing there facing the camera, holding the backpack against my chest with both arms. My face looked wrong, not distorted, just blank, like I was listening to someone behind me. Behind me, down through the trees, the frozen reservoir was visible in a thin gray strip. For about 2 seconds, before the clip ended, a soft white glow appeared under the ice near the shore. Then the video cut to black. I rented the cabin in northern Minnesota during the off-season because it was cheap and isolated. It sat beside a narrow lake surrounded by pine trees with only 2 other cabins nearby, both empty that week according to the owner. The place itself was small. 1 bedroom, wood stove, old screened porch facing the water. No cell service unless you drove 10 minutes back toward the highway. I got there on a rainy Thursday afternoon in late October. By midnight, the rain had stopped, but fog rolled in over the lake, thick enough that I couldn't see the opposite shoreline anymore. The temperature dropped hard, too. Every window in the cabin fogged slightly around the edges. I stayed up late reading near the wood stove while wind pushed softly through the trees outside. Nothing strange at first. Around maybe 4 in the morning, I woke suddenly without knowing why. The room looked brighter than before, not daylight bright, just faintly illuminated through the curtains facing the lake. At first, I thought maybe sunrise was starting early through the fog somehow. Then I checked the clock beside the bed. 4:07 a.m. Still completely dark outside. I sat there listening. No wind anymore. No tree movement. The cabin had gone dead quiet except for the occasional creak from cooling wood in the stove. The pale light behind the curtains remained steady. I remember immediately assuming somebody had driven up outside, maybe another renter or the owner checking something unexpectedly. But there was no sound of tires on gravel. No engine. Nothing. I got out of bed and walked to the window. The closer I got, the stranger the light looked through the curtains. Softer somehow, not harsh like headlights. I pulled one side of the curtain back slightly. There was a white glow hanging over the lake, maybe 30 or 40 feet above the water, completely silent. For a second, my brain tried turning it into something normal. Boat light, helicopter, reflection from another cabin. But it didn't fit any of those. The glow stayed perfectly still above the fog-covered lake, and the water beneath it looked wrong. That was the first thing that truly unsettled me. The light barely reflected on the lake surface at all. I could see faint brightness touching the fog around it, but the water below stayed dark except for a weak, blurred patch directly underneath, not even close to how light should have reflected. I stared long enough that my eyes started watering. The glow itself wasn't sharply defined, more like a pale sphere hidden behind mist. Sometimes it looked circular, other times stretched slightly taller. I checked the sky above it. Nothing. No stars visible through the cloud cover. No aircraft lights. I remember whispering, "What are you?" without meaning to. The second I spoke, the glow shifted sideways, very slowly, still silent. The movement made my stomach tighten immediately because it didn't drift naturally like fog or lantern light. It moved with purpose somehow. I backed away from the window, then stopped because something tapped softly against the porch screen outside. One tap, then another. I froze completely. The screened porch wrapped around the front of the cabin facing the lake. To reach it, something would have to cross directly past the windows first. Another soft tap came from outside, metallic this time, like fingernails against aluminum screen framing. I moved carefully toward the front room without turning lights on. The cabin floor creaked under me louder than usual. When I reached the living room window, I looked through the porch screen toward the lake. The glow remained there. Closer now, maybe. Hard to judge distance over water in darkness. The fog around the lake looked brighter beneath it. Then I noticed something else. The porch floorboards were wet, not from rain leaking in. Individual damp footprints crossed the porch from left to right. I stared at them, trying to understand what I was seeing. Bare footprints, human-looking mostly, except oddly long. The toes appeared stretched somehow by water running across the wood grain. They ended near the porch steps leading outside. I remember becoming very aware then that the cabin door behind me was still locked. I checked it immediately anyway. Locked. Windows shut too. The footprints remained outside only. The glow over the lake drifted slightly lower. Then the tapping sound came again from farther down the porch. 3 slow taps. Tap, tap, tap. I looked toward the sound and saw movement near the porch corner. Not clearly. Just darker motion against darkness, like someone passing between fog and screen. I stepped backward immediately. The movement stopped. My heart was pounding hard enough I could hear it. I grabbed the fireplace poker from beside the stove, mostly because it was the only thing nearby. The glow outside dimmed slightly. At the same moment, all the sounds around the lake disappeared. I hadn't noticed frogs or insects earlier until they were gone. Even the tiny waves against shore stopped. The silence felt physical. Then came a low hum. Very faint. Not from the cabin, from outside over the lake. The glow brightened again while the humming continued, and suddenly I realized the fog wasn't moving around it naturally. It curled inward slightly toward the light. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it looked like the mist itself was being pulled. The wet footprints on the porch glistened faintly in the pale light. I kept staring at them because it grounded me somehow. They were physical. Real. Then one new footprint appeared near the porch steps. I didn't see something step there. The wet print simply darkened into visibility on the wood. Fresh. I backed into the kitchen immediately after that. Part of me wanted to turn every light on in the cabin. Another part felt terrified to make myself visible through the windows. The humming grew slightly louder. Cabinet glasses rattled softly. The clock on the microwave flickered once and reset to 12. Then everything stopped. The humming vanished. The glow outside remained steady. I forced myself back toward the window again because not looking somehow felt worse. Outside, the lake surface looked perfectly still now. Too still. The pale glow hovered maybe 20 feet above the water near the dock, and beneath it, something dark stood at the shoreline. At first, I thought it was a tree stump. Then the shape moved slightly sideways. Tall, thin, not enough detail to make out more than that. I remember gripping the poker so tightly my hand cramped. The shape remained near the dock facing the cabin. At least it felt like it was facing the cabin. Then the glow shifted upward slightly, and the dark figure disappeared into the fog completely. Gone instantly. The glow stayed another few seconds. Then it moved out across the lake silently. Not fast, just smooth and level. The strange part was the water beneath it still refused to reflect properly. The lake stayed dark except for that faint blurred patch directly below. Eventually the glow dimmed enough that it blended into the fog entirely. Then nothing remained. No sound. No light. Just dark lake again. I stayed awake until sunrise, sitting in a kitchen chair holding the fireplace poker like an idiot. Every small cabin noise made me jump. Around 6:30, gray daylight finally started filtering through the windows. The lake looked normal again. Fog thinning, cold wind returning through the trees. I convinced myself the footprints on the porch had probably belonged to me somehow from earlier rain. Then I opened the front door. The porch boards were covered in wet footprints. Dozens. They circled the cabin twice, not just the porch, the entire cabin. I followed them around the outside slowly. The prints stayed evenly spaced all the way through wet leaves and mud. Always barefoot, always slightly too long, and they never overlapped my own footprints from arriving earlier. Near the back wall of the cabin, the tracks passed directly beneath the bedroom window where I'd first seen the glow. Then they continued toward the lakeshore. I followed them all the way to the dock. The morning air smelled strongly of wet metal for some reason. The footprints crossed the dock boards clearly, then stopped halfway to the end. Not faded. Stopped. No return prints. Nothing in the water below except dark ripples moving gently against the posts. I stood there staring at the final footprint for a long time. Then I noticed something else. The wood around the last print was still wet, even though the rest of the dock had already started drying in the morning wind. I worked track maintenance for a freight line outside Amarillo for about 5 years, mostly overnight inspection work, replacing signal hardware, checking switches, clearing debris after storms. The route I covered ran through long stretches of empty land with isolated crossings every few miles. This happened in late April during one of those dry, windy nights where dust hangs in the air even after sunset. The sky stayed cloudy but bright enough that you could still see the outline of the land around you. I was alone that shift. Around 1:15 in the morning, I was parked near an old crossing road called Mercer Road, checking a signal cabinet that had been acting up earlier that week. It wasn't a busy crossing, just a 2-lane farm road cutting through flat land and barbed wire fences. The nearest scheduled train wasn't due until after 4. I remember that specifically because dispatch had warned us the line would stay quiet for several hours while another crew handled maintenance farther south. I'd just finished tightening connections inside the signal cabinet when the crossing bells activated behind me. Suddenly. Loud as hell in the middle of the night. The red lights started flashing and the crossing arms lowered across the road. I jumped because it happened without warning. My first thought was track circuit malfunction. It happened occasionally with bad weather or grounding issues, but something immediately felt off. No vibration in the rails. Usually even distant trains carried a faint hum through the tracks long before headlights appeared. Now there was nothing, just bells, flashing red lights, and wind pushing dust across the road. I walked over to the tracks and looked both directions. Empty. Completely dark. The crossing continued running. I radioed dispatch, asking if any unscheduled movement entered the section. Static answered first. Then dispatch came back confused. No traffic in your zone. I remember glancing at the rails while talking. One of them reflected light strangely, not from the crossing signals. A pale white reflection stretched along the top of the steel farther down the line northbound. I stepped closer, squinting into the dark. That's when I saw the light itself. It hovered maybe 3 or 4 feet above the rails about half a mile away. Soft white. Not bright enough to illuminate the land around it much. Just this pale circular glow suspended above the tracks. At first, I honestly thought somebody had a maintenance lantern out there. Then I realized it wasn't moving like a person carrying a light. It stayed perfectly level over the rails, and completely silent. The crossing bells kept ringing behind me. I told dispatch I thought another maintenance crew might be on the line. They said nobody else was authorized in that section. The radio crackled badly during the conversation. So much static I had trouble hearing. While talking, I kept watching the light. It drifted slowly closer, not fast enough to seem threatening, but smooth, like it floated instead of traveled. Still no train sounds. No engine, no headlights behind it. The weirdest part was how the rails behaved underneath it. The steel reflected the glow long before the object itself reached that section of track, almost like the reflection moved ahead of it. The crossing signals continued flashing wildly, then every insect sound around the crossing stopped. I hadn't even noticed crickets before until they disappeared. The silence felt immediate and unnatural. Even the wind seemed quieter somehow. Dispatch asked if I was still there. I answered yes. Then they asked why my voice sounded distant. That made my stomach tighten. I was holding the radio right against my mouth. I looked back toward my truck parked beside the signal cabinet. Its headlights had dimmed noticeably. Not off, just weak-looking. The pale light above the tracks kept approaching. I could see now it wasn't exactly round. Its edges shifted slightly, almost blurry against the dark. I started walking backward away from the rails without meaning to. The crossing arms stayed lowered. Red lights flashed across the dust blowing through the road. Then I noticed another strange thing. The warning bell sound had slowed down. Not fully slower maybe, but deeper. Distorted somehow, like hearing it underwater. The pale light stopped moving. It hovered maybe 200 yards down the tracks now. I stared at it trying to make sense of the size. Sometimes it looked small as a lantern, then suddenly larger than a car headlight. The distance felt wrong. I don't know how else to explain it. The radio crackled again. This time I heard voices inside the static, not dispatch. Several overlapping voices talking too fast to understand. Then silence. I checked the radio channel display, thinking maybe interference crossed frequencies. The screen was blank, not dead, blank. No numbers, no backlight. The pale light drifted sideways slightly above the tracks. The crossing signals immediately sped back up to normal rhythm, then slowed again when the light stopped. That was the moment I realized the signals were reacting to it somehow, not malfunctioning randomly, reacting. My chest started pounding hard enough I could feel it in my throat. I remember looking toward the road, hoping headlights from another vehicle would appear. Nothing. Just empty farmland and flashing red crossing lights. Then I heard something metallic far down the tracks. Not a train, more like steel flexing under pressure. The rails beside me vibrated once very softly. The pale light brightened slightly, and for a second I saw something beneath it. Not clearly, just a darker shape suspended inside the glow. Long maybe. Vertical. I actually whispered, "What the hell?" out loud without realizing it. Then the crossing lights shut off instantly. Complete silence. The arms remained lowered though. That bothered me immediately because the system wasn't supposed to do that. No bells. No flashing. Just the wooden barriers stretched across the road while the pale light hovered down the tracks. The silence became so heavy I could hear my own breathing through my nose. Then came a low humming sound. Very faint. I felt it more through the ground than heard it. The rails beside me started vibrating continuously, not violently, just enough that small pebbles along the ties rattled softly. The pale light moved again, closer now, maybe 100 yards away, and suddenly the crossing arms rose back upward. The second they lifted, the humming stopped. Everything stopped. Even the vibration in the rails disappeared. But the light remained, hovering directly over the track center line. I became aware then that the air smelled strange, hot metal and rain together. The same smell you get before transformers blow during storms. I started backing toward my truck slowly. The light drifted another few yards closer, then stopped again. I could finally tell it wasn't attached to anything solid I recognized. No visible structure, no aircraft shape, just pale light wrapped around something darker at the center. My truck radio suddenly turned on by itself. Loud static burst from the cab speakers, hard enough to make me flinch. Headlights dimmed again, then brightened, then dimmed once more. I climbed into the truck immediately and locked the doors, which felt stupid because nothing about the situation made sense anyway. The pale light stayed outside above the tracks. I grabbed the company flashlight and aimed it through the windshield toward the object. The beam barely reached it. But for a second, the flashlight flickered strangely and reflected off something smooth near the center of the glow. Not metal exactly, more like wet glass. Then the flashlight died completely. Full battery gone. At the same moment, the pale light began drifting south along the rails. Not toward me anymore, away. The crossing signals activated again instantly behind it. Bells started ringing, lights flashing, like the system tracked the thing moving down the line. I watched it glide slowly across the dark farmland above the rails, while each crossing farther south began activating one after another in sequence. I could actually see distant red flashes miles away. The signals triggered ahead of it. The light never changed speed. Still silent, still low above the tracks. Then the truck engine shut off. No sputtering, just dead. The dashboard lights remained on though. I sat frozen, gripping the wheel while the pale glow drifted farther away down the line. Eventually it became small enough to mistake for a distant signal light, then smaller, then gone. The crossing bells at Mercer Road stopped immediately afterward. Everything returned to normal all at once. Wind noise, crickets, even the smell faded. I sat there another 10 minutes before trying the truck again. Started perfectly. Radio working, headlights normal. I called dispatch back. They sounded irritated because apparently they'd been trying to reach me for nearly 40 minutes. I looked at the dashboard clock. 2:03 a.m. That made no sense. The whole incident felt maybe 10 minutes long, 15 at absolute most. Dispatch asked if I'd fixed the signal malfunction. I almost told them everything. Instead, I just said the crossing activated unexpectedly, but seemed normal now. They asked if a train passed. I said no. Then dispatch got quiet for a second before telling me something strange. 3 crossings south of Mercer Road had activated sequentially around the same time with no trains detected in the system. Each one shut off after about 30 seconds, like something moved through the line without touching the tracks. I drove home after sunrise. Before leaving, I checked the rails where the light had hovered closest. The steel looked discolored there, not burned, just oddly pale compared to the surrounding track. And along one section of ballast rock beside the rails, every small stone had been turned in the same direction, like something had pushed air across them in one smooth sweep. I was driving through western Montana late at night when this happened. It was early October, cold enough that patches of old snow still sat in the trees above the highway. I'd been on the road for hours already, heading east through the mountains after visiting a friend near Coeur d'Alene. The weather had turned ugly around midnight. Not full rain, more like freezing mist blowing across the road in waves. My windshield kept fogging around the edges, even with the heat running. There weren't many other cars out that late, which made the whole drive feel isolated fast. Around 1:30 in the morning, I reached one of the mountain tunnels off I-90. I don't remember the exact name now, just that it was longer than I expected. Concrete walls, yellow sodium lights overhead every 50 feet or so. I remember checking the fuel gauge before entering because I was planning to stop at the next town. The tunnel entrance looked black against the mountainside. The second I drove inside, the radio filled with static. Not unusual in tunnels, but it happened instantly, like somebody flipped a switch. I lowered the volume and kept driving. The tunnel curved slightly at first before straightening out. That's when I noticed the light at the far exit. At first I thought it was headlights outside the tunnel entrance on the opposite side. But after a few seconds I realized it didn't look right. It was perfectly circular, bright white, and completely still. Usually, tunnel exits expand gradually as you approach them. You see trees or sky around the opening eventually. This didn't change size at all. It stayed the exact same distance-looking circle no matter how far I drove. I remember gripping the steering wheel harder because my brain kept trying to correct what I was seeing. The tunnel lights passed overhead steadily. The circle remained fixed ahead. I checked my speedometer, 55, normal speed. The tunnel definitely wasn't that long. I'd driven through enough of them before to know the exit should have gotten closer quickly. Instead, the light just sat there waiting at the far end. Not blinding bright either. Soft somehow. Like light through frosted glass. I glanced in the rearview mirror expecting maybe exhaustion was messing with me. The tunnel behind looked normal, yellow lights shrinking into darkness, no cars behind me. When I looked forward again, the circular light appeared slightly lower than before. That's when I noticed another strange thing. The inside of the tunnel had gone quiet. My tires still hummed against pavement, but the sound felt muffled. Even the engine noise seemed farther away. Then my dashboard clock flickered, just once. 12:44 became 12 for half a second before returning. I remember because I thought my battery might be failing. The circular light ahead remained perfectly unchanged. I started counting the overhead tunnel lights to calm myself down. 10 passed. 20. 30. Still no closer. That's when I first felt actual fear, not panic. Just this growing certainty that something about the tunnel was wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I picked up my phone from the passenger seat. No service. Again, normal for tunnels. But the phone itself felt unusually warm in my hand. I opened the camera thinking maybe recording the tunnel would help me judge distance somehow. The screen showed the tunnel normally for a second. Then the image distorted. Not glitching exactly. More like the brightness kept pulling toward the center where the circular light sat. The tunnel walls looked darker on screen than in real life. I shut the camera off immediately. The air inside the car smelled strange then. Not smoke, almost metallic, like wet pennies. I cracked the window briefly, thinking maybe something in the vents overheated. Cold air rushed inside, carrying the same smell. Then I heard something outside the car, a sound matching my speed. Not another vehicle, more like soft tapping along the passenger side. Tap, tap, tap. I looked right immediately. Nothing there except tunnel wall sliding past. The tapping stopped, then resumed on the driver's side instead. Very light, like fingertips brushing metal. I sped up without thinking, 65 now. The circular light ahead stayed exactly the same size. That was the moment my stomach really dropped. I actually said out loud, no, because it became impossible to ignore. I should have reached the exit already. The tunnel overhead lights suddenly seemed farther apart too. Darker between them. I checked the rearview mirror again. The tunnel behind no longer curved. It stretched perfectly straight into darkness. I know tunnels don't reshape themselves. I know that sounds insane, but I remembered the bend near the entrance clearly because I'd adjusted the wheel when entering. Now it looked dead straight. The tapping sound came back louder this time, not on the doors anymore. Above me. 3 slow knocks against the roof of the car. Knock, knock, knock. I ducked automatically, even though I knew how stupid that was. The tunnel lights flickered, just once. During the flicker, I saw something standing near the wall ahead on the right side of the tunnel. Tall shape. Still. Gone when the lights stabilized again. I slammed the brakes instinctively. The tires squealed slightly on damp pavement. The car slowed hard enough that my seatbelt locked. And still, the circular light ahead didn't change distance. That terrified me more than anything else. I sat there, breathing hard in the middle of the tunnel. The engine idled roughly. No other cars appeared. No sounds except ventilation fans somewhere far away overhead. Then the circular light brightened slightly. Not larger, just brighter. And I realized it wasn't actually at the tunnel exit. It sat inside the tunnel itself, hovering above the road. I could suddenly see darkness around it. The realization hit me so hard I almost stalled the car, trying to accelerate again. I drove faster, 70 now. Tunnel lights streaked overhead. The circular light remained fixed in front of me, no matter what speed I reached. Then my radio crackled alive again. Static blasted through the speakers, followed by a voice. At least I thought it was a voice. It sounded distant and stretched out, like audio slowed down too far to understand. I switched the radio off completely. The sound continued another 2 seconds through dead speakers before stopping. I remember becoming aware then that the tunnel walls looked wet, not damp from weather. Glossy, reflective. My headlights slid across them strangely, and every reflection seemed delayed by a fraction of a second. The tapping returned on the roof. This time it moved, from the back of the car slowly toward the windshield. Tap, 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 tracking above me. I hunched lower in the seat, gripping the wheel so hard my hands cramped. The circular light remained dead center ahead. Then something changed with the tunnel air pressure. My ears popped painfully. The windshield fogged instantly from the outside. Not fully. Just enough that the tunnel blurred around the edges. Except the circular light stayed perfectly sharp through the fog. I heard another sound then. Breathing. Not mine. Very faint from somewhere inside the car. I checked the back seat immediately. Empty. But the smell of wet metal grew much stronger. My phone screen lit up suddenly on the passenger seat. No notification. Just lit itself. The front camera was active. I know it was because I could see the tiny green indicator. The screen faced upward toward the ceiling, and reflected faintly in the glass, I saw something pale moving across the roof outside the car. Long shape, smooth, keeping pace. I grabbed the phone and threw it into the back seat without looking again. At that exact moment, the circular light vanished. Completely gone. Dark tunnel ahead. Then suddenly, I burst out the far exit. Cold night exploded around the car. Wind, trees, open mountain road. I nearly swerved onto the shoulder because the transition happened so abruptly. The tunnel behind me shrank in the mirror immediately like normal distance, finally returned all at once. I kept driving another mile before pulling over at a scenic turnout. My hands shook so badly I dropped my keys trying to shut the engine off. Outside, the mountains looked normal. Mist moving through pines, distant highway sounds below. The metallic smell lingered inside the car. I checked the time. 1:58 a.m. That made no sense. The tunnel crossing should have taken maybe 2 minutes. 3 at most. I grabbed my phone from the back seat, battery down to 2%. The camera app still open. At first, the screen looked black. Then I realized it wasn't. There was video playing silently. The footage showed the inside roof of my car, dark fabric ceiling lit by occasional tunnel lights. The timestamp showed 6 minutes of recording. For most of it, nothing happened. Then around halfway through, the ceiling slowly brightened with reflected white light. And near the rear windshield, something briefly crossed into frame. Not fully visible, just long, pale fingers sliding across the outside glass before disappearing upward again. I deleted the video immediately, or at least I tried to. The phone froze until the battery died in my hand. While sitting there at the turnout, another car finally emerged from the tunnel behind me. Pickup truck. Normal headlights. It slowed briefly as it passed my parked car. The driver looked over at me strangely, then continued down the highway. I watched his taillights disappear around the bend. After that, I looked back toward the tunnel entrance one last time. For a second, I thought I saw the same circular light again, far inside it. Small, perfectly round, waiting motionless in the dark. I was hunting alone in eastern Tennessee when this happened. Out near a stretch of private woodland a friend let me use during deer season. The property backed against miles of dense trees and rolling hills with almost no houses nearby. I'd hunted there plenty of times before and knew the trails well enough to walk them in the dark without a flashlight. That morning, I got to the blind around 4:45 a.m. Still completely dark outside. Cold enough that frost-covered dead leaves and the wooden steps up to the blind felt slick under my boots. The sky overhead looked cloudy but not stormy, just thick gray-black overcast with no stars visible. The blind itself sat about 12 feet off the ground, overlooking a clearing, maybe 70 yards wide. Trees surrounded it on 3 sides. Nothing unusual about the setup. I climbed inside, shut the little wooden door quietly behind me, and settled in to wait for first light. Normally mornings out there were loud even before sunrise. Owls, insects, birds waking up gradually once the sky started changing. That morning felt different immediately. Too quiet. At first I figured the cold snap scared everything off. I remember checking my phone before putting it away. 4:58 a.m. No signal out there as usual. I sat there maybe 15 minutes listening to wind push through the trees outside. Then the wind stopped. Not slowly, just gone. The silence afterward felt strange enough that I noticed it right away. No leaves moving anymore, no branches creaking, nothing. I shifted slightly in the blind and even my jacket sounded too loud. That's when I noticed the light. It hovered above the tree line across the clearing. Bright white. Not glaring or flashing, just steady. At first I assumed it was a tower light or maybe a distant helicopter facing toward me, but something about the position looked wrong. The light sat too low above the trees and didn't move at all. I stared at it for maybe a minute, waiting for blinking lights or aircraft noise. Nothing came. The light remained perfectly still. I remember actually getting annoyed with it because once I noticed it, I couldn't stop looking back. I forced myself to scan the clearing for deer movement instead. A few minutes later, I glanced toward the tree line again. The light looked closer, not dramatically closer, but larger somehow. I frowned and leaned nearer to the blind window, trying to judge distance. Still silent, still hovering above the trees. The weird part was I couldn't figure out what I was actually looking at. Sometimes it resembled one bright light. Other times it looked softer around the edges, almost blurred. I checked my phone again, 5:21. That surprised me because it felt like maybe 5 minutes had passed. I put the phone away and kept watching the clearing. No animals moved anywhere, not even squirrels. The woods remained dead silent. That started bothering me more than the light itself. I've spent enough mornings outside to know forests are never truly silent before dawn. Even during bad weather, you hear something. Now there was absolutely nothing. Then came a sound underneath the blind. A single slow crunch in the leaves. I froze immediately. Another crunch followed a few seconds later, heavy enough to sound like a person walking. I leaned carefully toward the side window and looked down. Darkness beneath the blind. No flashlight beam, no visible movement. The steps leading up remained empty. I listened hard. Nothing else came. After maybe 30 seconds, I looked back toward the light. Closer again. That's when my stomach tightened for the first time, because the trees beneath it looked clearer now. Not because daylight arrived, because the light itself seemed nearer to the clearing. I know that makes no sense if it never moved, but that's exactly how it felt. Like every time I stopped looking directly at it, the distance shortened slightly. I rubbed my eyes thinking maybe fog or darkness distorted perspective. Then I noticed something else. The light wasn't reflecting normally on the wet leaves below. Parts of the clearing should have been illuminated by then if it was really that bright. Instead, the ground stayed oddly dark. Only the edges of some branches caught faint, pale highlights. I became aware then of a smell in the air. Wet metal, almost electrical. The same smell you get near overheated wires. I checked the heater pack in my backpack, thinking maybe batteries leak or something. Nothing wrong there. Outside the blind, the smell remained. The light stayed fixed above the tree line. I tried ignoring it again. Maybe another 20 minutes passed, or at least I thought it did. I started feeling strangely tired. Not sleepy exactly, more mentally slow. My thoughts kept drifting. Then another crunch sounded beneath the blind. Closer this time. I leaned toward the floor, instinctively listening. The wooden platform vibrated slightly under my boots. Not enough to shake visibly. Just a faint pressure like someone resting a hand against the support post below. I whispered, "Hello?" No answer. The woods remained silent. I slowly raised my rifle toward the floor hatch, even though I knew how ridiculous that was. Then I noticed something that made my chest go cold. No condensation came from my breath anymore. The air inside the blind felt warmer, suddenly. Not comfortable warm. Wrong warm. Like stepping indoors unexpectedly. I checked outside again. The light above the trees appeared much larger now. Still perfectly still. And definitely lower. I could make out faint fog around it, even though the rest of the woods looked clear. I finally decided it had to be somebody with equipment out there. Maybe another hunter breaking rules with spotlights. But if somebody stood that close to the clearing, I should have heard movement. Nothing moved. Nothing called. Nothing flew overhead. Then the blind wall behind me creaked softly. Not from wind. Pressure. Like somebody leaning against the outside boards. I spun around immediately. The rear window showed only dark trees. Another soft creak came from the same spot. I held perfectly still listening. Then 3 slow knocks sounded against the outside wall. Knock, 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 knock. Not loud. Careful. Measured. I remember every muscle in my body locking instantly. The light outside remained motionless beyond the clearing, but somehow closer again. Large enough now that it no longer looked distant above the trees. It seemed level with them. I checked my phone again with shaking hands. 6:43 a.m. That made no sense at all. Daylight should have started already, but outside remained dim, gray darkness. I opened the weather app automatically before realizing there was still no signal. The battery showed 12%. It had been nearly full earlier. Then the screen flickered once and shut off completely. The knocking outside the blind came again, this time from beneath me, directly under the floor. 3 slow knocks. The wooden boards vibrated lightly with each one. I stood up so fast my shoulder hit the ceiling. The blind suddenly felt too small. The smell of wet metal had grown much stronger. Then came another sound from outside. Breathing. Slow. Not animal snorting. Human breathing. Right beside the blind wall, I grabbed the side window latch and almost opened it before stopping myself. Every instinct I had screamed not to look outside that closely. Instead, I forced myself toward the front opening again. The clearing looked empty. The light hovered above the trees, and for the first time I realized the trees directly beneath it looked darker than everything else around them. Not shadowed. Absent somehow. Then the light brightened slightly. At the exact same moment, every hair on my arm stood up. A low humming noise filled the air. Very faint. I felt it more in my teeth than my ears. The blind floor vibrated softly beneath me. Outside, the clearing grass bent slightly inward toward the trees as if wind pushed from one direction. But there was still no actual wind. The humming deepened. and suddenly I became certain something stood directly underneath the blind looking upward. I don't know why I felt that so strongly. I just knew. I backed against the rear wall, breathing hard. The knocking stopped. The humming continued another few seconds. Then everything went silent again. Complete silence. Even my own breathing sounded muffled somehow. The light above the tree line dimmed slightly, and daylight appeared all at once, not gradually. One moment, gray darkness filled the clearing. The next, pale morning light spread across the woods. Birds should have exploded into noise immediately. They didn't. The forest stayed dead silent. The bright, hovering light was gone, completely vanished. No movement away, no fading upward, just gone. I sat there stunned, trying to understand what happened. The clearing looked ordinary again. Cold morning fog between trees, frost on grass. Nothing unusual. Then I realized I hadn't heard a single bird all morning. Not one. That hit me harder than the light disappearing. Because I suddenly understood how unnatural the silence had been the entire time. I climbed down from the blind fast enough that I nearly slipped on the ladder. The ground underneath looked undisturbed at first. Then I noticed the leaves directly beneath the blind's supports, flattened in a rough circle around the base. Not footprints exactly, more like something heavy had stood there long enough to press moisture from the leaves into the dirt. The smell of wet metal lingered faintly in the air. I walked back toward my truck quickly without stopping. The woods remained strangely quiet for another several minutes. Then gradually normal sounds returned. First distant crows, then smaller birds, then wind again through branches. By the time I reached the truck, everything sounded ordinary. I checked the dashboard clock after starting the engine. 8:12 a.m. I stared at it for a long time because, according to my phone earlier, it should have been around 7 at most. I drove out without going back for another hunt. About halfway down the dirt access road, I looked in the rearview mirror toward the tree line one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw the same pale light standing motionless between the trees. Not above them anymore. At ground level, watching from deep in the woods before the road curved and blocked the view. I'd been driving freight across the Midwest for almost 11 hours when I pulled into the lot outside Salina, Kansas. It wasn't a real truck stop, just one of those oversized gravel lots behind a closed farm supply store where drivers sometimes parked overnight when the interstate rest areas filled up. It was late August, hot even after midnight. The air outside smelled like dry dirt and diesel fuel, and heat still radiated off the pavement long after sunset. I remember leaving the cab windows cracked because the sleeper AC wasn't working right, unless the engine stayed running, and I hated idling all night. There were 3 other trucks in the lot when I parked, one refrigerated trailer humming near the far fence, 2 semis parked nose to tail closer to the road. By around 1 a.m., all their lights were off. I filled out part of my handwritten logbook, ate crackers from the cooler, and passed out almost immediately. The next thing I remember was waking up because the inside of the cab looked bright. Not daylight bright, just pale. For a second I thought morning had come early. Then I looked at the dashboard clock, 2:17 a.m. The sleeper compartment glowed dim white from every direction, not from one source. That's what confused me first. Usually if another truck pulls in with headlights on, light comes through the curtains in streaks. This felt different, soft and even, like fog somehow got inside the cab and carried light with it. I sat up slowly, still half asleep. The cab looked normal otherwise. My boots on the floor, thermos beside the bunk, keys hanging from the dash, but everything had this washed-out color to it. I listened for engines outside. Nothing. Complete silence. Even the refrigerated trailer I'd heard earlier was quiet now. I reached over and pulled the sleeper curtain aside slightly. The lot outside was empty. Not dark. Empty looking. That's the best way I can explain it. The pale white glow covered the entire gravel lot evenly. But there were no headlights, no lampposts nearby, no moon visible overhead. The sky itself looked flat gray-white, almost like heavy fog, except I could still see clearly across the lot, and the other trucks were gone. Every parking space except mine sat empty. I remember staring a few seconds trying to wake myself up fully. Then I noticed there were no sounds at all. No highway noise from the interstate half a mile away. No insects. No distant traffic. Nothing. The silence bothered me enough that I checked whether my hearing had muffled from sleep somehow. I rubbed my ears and tapped the window glass with one fingernail. The tap sounded strange, too dull, like sound wasn't traveling right. I unlocked the cab door but didn't open it yet. The pale light outside remained perfectly steady. I kept searching for a source, street lights, security floodlights, anything. There was nothing. The glow seemed to exist without coming from anywhere. Then movement caught my eye near the edge of the lot. Something crossed slowly between the parked trailers near the road. At first, I thought another driver was walking around, but it moved oddly, too smooth maybe, hard to judge distance in the flat light. I stared harder and realized I couldn't actually make out a person, just a darker shape moving through pale brightness. Then it disappeared behind the trailers. I closed the curtain immediately after that. My heart had started beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. Inside the cab, the dim, white light still leaked through every window edge. I grabbed my phone from the bunk. No signal. Battery at 3% even though I charged it while driving. I remember checking the dashboard clock again because suddenly time felt strange. Still 2:17. The seconds changed normally. Nothing wrong there. Then came a soft metallic sound from outside near the driver's door. Not knocking exactly. More like fingertips dragging lightly across the truck body. Skirked. It moved slowly along the side of the cab toward the sleeper. I froze completely. The sound stopped near the rear window. Then silence again. I kept listening. Nothing. The pale light outside never changed intensity. After maybe 30 seconds, I forced myself toward the front seats and peeked through the windshield. The lot remained empty, but something about the gravel looked wrong. Too smooth. Usually truck lots are covered in tire ruts, trash, puddles, oil stains. Now the gravel looked almost flattened beneath the light. Then I noticed the fence at the far edge of the property. Or rather, I noticed I couldn't see it anymore. The lot simply faded into pale haze past a certain distance. I actually rubbed the windshield with my sleeve, thinking condensation blurred my view. Didn't help. The metallic scraping sound returned suddenly, this time across the roof of the cab. Slow. Heavy enough that the metal flexed slightly above me. I ducked instinctively. The sound traveled from front to back in one continuous motion, then stopped directly above the sleeper compartment. I remember holding my breath listening. A low humming sound filled the cab, very faint. Not from the engine, more like vibration through the frame itself. The dashboard lights flickered once. The clock briefly showed 2:88 before correcting back to 2:17. I know that sounds impossible, but I saw it clearly. The humming deepened slightly, and I became aware of a smell inside the truck. Wet dirt. Strong enough that I checked the floor mats, thinking maybe I'd tracked mud inside earlier. Everything looked dry. Then I glanced toward the passenger seat. Someone had moved my logbook. I knew exactly where I'd left it because I always kept it clipped beside the cooler overnight. Now it sat open across the passenger seat, pages fluttering slightly despite no air movement. I stared at it for several seconds before reaching over. One entire page was missing. Not torn messily either, cleanly removed. The pages before and after remained attached perfectly. I flipped through the book twice, making sure I wasn't losing my mind. The missing page should have contained that day's driving logs, gone completely. While staring at the logbook, I realized the humming had stopped. The silence afterward felt enormous. Then came another sound. Breathing, very faint, behind the cab, outside the sleeper window. Slow inhale, slow exhale. I sat frozen, gripping the logbook so hard the paper bent. The breathing continued maybe 3 more times, then stopped. I remember becoming certain something stood directly outside the sleeper compartment, inches away from the glass. Not because I saw anything, just knew. The pale light outside dimmed slightly, and for the first time I noticed shadows moving across the gravel. Long shadows, except nothing visible cast them. They slid slowly past the truck beneath the windows and disappeared. I shut my eyes for maybe 2 seconds. When I opened them again, the light outside had changed. Darker now, more natural. I looked through the windshield. The other trucks were back. The refrigerated trailer hummed loudly across the lot. Highway noise returned faintly from the interstate. Normal darkness again, except for scattered parking lot lamps in the distance. The dashboard clock read 3:41 a.m. I sat there breathing hard, trying to understand what happened. The hum was gone, the metallic smell gone too. Everything felt ordinary again, except the logbook page remained missing. I climbed out of the truck finally because staying inside suddenly felt impossible. Outside air hit me hard, warm, noisy, real. The gravel lot looked normal again, but near the driver's side door I noticed marks in the dust coating the truck. Long streaks. Not scratches. More like broad smears dragged downward through the dirt. 3 parallel lines about 2 feet long. I touched one. Fresh dust came away on my fingertips along with damp soil underneath. The weirdest part came when I checked the ground around the truck. The gravel directly beneath the sleeper compartment was wet, not soaked, just darker than the rest of the lot in a rough oval shape. And mixed into the gravel were dozens of tiny pale fragments, almost translucent, like crushed shells or thin pieces of glass. They reflected strangely under my flashlight. I picked one up. It crumbled instantly between my fingers into fine powder that smelled faintly metallic. I slept maybe another hour after sunrise finally started coming up. Before leaving, I walked the lot once more looking for security cameras or floodlights that might explain the strange lighting. Nothing nearby could have illuminated the lot the way I saw it. When I climbed back into the cab to start driving, I noticed something else about the logbook. The missing page hadn't been ripped out normally. The paper edges along the binding looked smooth, almost heat-sealed, like the page had never been there at all. I worked a harvest season at a vineyard outside Paso Robles a few years back. Most of the job was normal field work, checking irrigation, repairing lines, moving bins, dealing with pumps that constantly failed when temperatures dropped at night. The vineyard stretched across low rolling hills with rows running so far out that at dusk the vines blended together into dark stripes. After sunset, the place felt bigger than it really was. Easy to lose your sense of distance out there. This happened in early October during harvest. The days were still hot, but nights cooled off fast once the sun disappeared behind the hills. That evening, a few irrigation zones had lost pressure, so my supervisor asked if I could drive out and check the valves before heading home. I started around 7 p.m. By then, the workers were already gone, and the tasting room lights near the main road had shut off. Just me, the utility cart, and acres of vines disappearing into darkness. The sky stayed clear, but unusually dim. No moon visible yet. The last sunlight sat low and orange behind the hills while the rows themselves turned black. I remember noticing how still the air felt. Usually, evenings out there had at least some breeze moving through the vines. That night, the leaves barely twitched. I drove slowly along the dirt service path, checking emitters and pressure gauges with a flashlight. Nothing strange at first. Around 7:45, I reached one of the farther irrigation sectors near the western edge of the property. No buildings nearby, just rows of vines stretching downhill toward dry fields and oak trees. That's where I saw the light. At first, I thought another worker stayed late. There was a pale white glow moving between the rows maybe 300 yards away. Not bright, soft and steady. I couldn't see a flashlight beam or headlights, just this glow drifting slowly through the vines. I stopped the cart and watched it. The weird thing was how silent it seemed. If somebody walked through those rows, you normally heard branches brushing clothes or gravel crunching under boots. Nothing now. The light moved smoothly between the vines without any visible body attached to it. I remember actually calling out once. "Hey!" No answer. The glow kept drifting. Then I noticed the vines nearest it swaying, not violently, just moving gently inward toward the light as it passed. That made me step out of the cart, because the air around me remained completely still. No breeze touched my face. The vines beside me didn't move at all. Only the rows near the glow shifted slowly. I watched another minute, trying to convince myself wind moved unevenly through the hills. Then the light stopped. The vines around it continued swaying softly for several seconds afterward. I checked my phone automatically. No signal. Battery lower than I expected too. Down around 10% even though it had been nearly full earlier. The glow remained motionless between the rows. I remember the smell hitting me next. Wet dirt. Stronger than normal irrigation water smell, almost metallic underneath. The light drifted again suddenly. Closer this time. Not directly toward me, diagonal across the rows. The vines nearest it bent slightly as it passed, I could see leaves trembling around the glow while the rest of the vineyard stayed perfectly still. That's when my stomach tightened, because there was no way wind explained it anymore. I climbed back into the utility cart thinking maybe I should just leave and tell myself later it was another worker with equipment. But before I could start driving, the cart lights dimmed briefly. The engine stayed running. The headlights just weakened for maybe 2 seconds. When they brightened again, the glow had stopped closer than before. Maybe 100 yards now, still no visible source. I grabbed the flashlight from the passenger seat and aimed it toward the rose. The beam reached partway before getting swallowed by darkness between vines. But for 1 second, I thought I saw something tall moving behind the glow. Not clearly, just darker motion among darker rows. Then gone. The vines continued swaying around it. I shut the flashlight off immediately. The vineyard had become unnaturally quiet by then. No insects, no distant highway noise. Even the cart engine sounded muffled somehow. The glow drifted another row closer. I remember noticing it didn't really illuminate the ground properly. Leaves nearest it brightened faintly, but the dirt beneath stayed oddly dark. Then came a sound from somewhere farther down the rows, a soft clicking noise, slow, rhythmic. Not mechanical exactly, almost like stones tapping together. The glow paused. The clicking stopped too. I became very aware then that I was completely alone on that side of the property. The nearest building sat probably half a mile away, hidden behind hills. The radio clipped to my belt crackled suddenly loud enough to make me jump. Static burst through for several seconds. Then a voice cut through briefly. Not words I could understand, just low speech drowned interference. I grabbed the radio immediately. "Carlos, you there?" Only static answered. Then silence. The glow moved again, this time directly across the row facing me, and the vines bent inward sharply as it passed, almost touching each other over the dirt. The movement looked wrong, too synchronized, like something heavy displaced air around it. I reversed the cart without taking my eyes off the rows. The tires slipped slightly on loose dirt. The glow stopped immediately. Then everything went silent again. No clicking, no radio, nothing. The stillness felt heavy enough that my ears rang. Then the vines directly ahead of me started moving, not the ones near the glow anymore. Rows, maybe 30 feet away from my cart, swayed slowly, though no wind touched anything else. The leaves rustled softly in a narrow line moving toward me through the vineyard. I couldn't see anything causing it, just movement passing between rows. My headlights suddenly flickered again. The engine coughed once, then the cart died completely. No lights, no engine. Darkness swallowed everything except the pale glow farther off among the vines. I sat frozen, gripping the wheel. The moving rustling continued closer through the rows. 1 row away now. I could hear leaves brushing softly together. Then the sound stopped beside me, not in front, directly beside the cart. I turned slowly toward the passenger side. Nothing visible there except dark vine trunks and irrigation tubing, but the smell of wet dirt had become overpowering. Then the cart roof creaked once above me, very softly, like weight settling onto metal. I ducked instinctively. The glow remained motionless farther out among the rows, and for 1 second I realized something terrifying. It wasn't lighting the vines around it anymore. The vines themselves seemed pale, as if the glow came from within the rows somehow instead of shining onto them. The roof creaked again overhead. Then 3 soft taps sounded against the metal frame. Tap, tap, tap. I bailed out of the cart immediately. I don't even remember deciding to move. I sprinted down the dirt path toward the main access road, carrying only the flashlight and radio. Behind me, the vineyard remained silent except for occasional rustling moving somewhere parallel through the rows. I never looked directly back at the glow while running, partly because I was afraid it would suddenly appear closer again. The flashlight beam bounced wildly over irrigation pipes and dirt. Twice I nearly fell, crossing drainage grooves. Then suddenly the normal sounds of the vineyard returned all at once. Crickets, wind through leaves, distant highway noise. My radio crackled normally again with another worker asking if I'd finished the pressure check. I stopped running long enough to look back. The rows behind me sat dark and still. No glow anywhere, no moving vines. Just ordinary nighttime vineyard shadows. I drove back toward the maintenance shed after getting another cart. Didn't mention what happened to anyone. I told myself maybe exhaustion and darkness distorted everything. Then the next morning, the foreman called several of us out before sunrise to inspect damage in the western sector. A narrow path cut through the vineyard. Flattened vines stretched in a nearly straight line across multiple rows, not crushed randomly like vehicle damage, pressed downward evenly. The path continued over irrigation tubing and support wires without breaking most of them, just flattened. The vines looked wet too, even though irrigation there had been off overnight. The foreman assumed somebody drove equipment illegally through the property, but there were no tire tracks anywhere, no footprints either. Just this long, narrow, flattened corridor disappearing into the rows toward the western hills. I followed it farther than the others did. The farther out it went, the stranger it looked. Leaves along the edges had turned pale gray instead of green, not dead exactly, discolored, and the dirt underneath smelled strongly metallic. Near the far end of the path, I found my flashlight lying beside an irrigation valve. I didn't remember dropping it. The lens was cracked inward like something heavy had pressed directly against the glass. When I picked it up, damp soil coated the handle. Mixed into the dirt were tiny pale fragments that glittered strangely in the morning light. Not rocks, something thinner, almost translucent. I rubbed one between my fingers and it collapsed instantly into fine powder. I drove down to the Outer Banks alone one November for a few days off. Nothing planned. Just rented a cheap room inland and spent mornings driving out to remote beach access points before sunrise because I liked walking when nobody else was around. This happened near Cape Hatteras on a cold, windy morning right before tourist season fully died off. I left the motel around 4:30 a.m. The roads were empty except for occasional fishing trucks heading toward the coast. Weather had turned weird overnight. Thick clouds covered the sky low enough that everything reflected a dull gray glow even in darkness. Not raining exactly, but mist kept blowing across the highway in bursts. The beach access road I took ran through long stretches of dunes and scrub brush with almost no lighting, just narrow pavement cutting through sand hills toward the ocean. About 10 minutes down the road, I saw the light. At first, I assumed it was another vehicle parked near the beach. There was a bright white glow resting above the dunes ahead, not high in the sky, maybe 30 or 40 feet above the sand. The strange thing was how steady it looked. No blinking, no movement, and no visible beam hitting the ground. I slowed slightly, trying to figure out if somebody had set up floodlights for fishing or maintenance work. The closer I drove, the farther away the light seemed. Not dramatically. Just enough that I kept thinking, okay, maybe it's over the next dune instead. But every time I reached another bend in the road, the glow remained the same size and same distance ahead. I remember checking the speedometer because it started bothering me how long I'd been following it. 45 miles an hour. Normal. The road itself definitely moved forward, but the light never seemed any closer. The dunes around me looked darker than they should have under that much brightness too. Usually headlights or floodlights throw shadows across sand. This glow barely illuminated anything except a faint pale haze around itself. Then I noticed the ocean, or rather, I noticed I couldn't hear it. The beach sat maybe half a mile away by then. Normally you heard waves long before reaching shore, especially with wind like that. Now there was nothing except my engine and tires on pavement. I cracked the window slightly. Cold, salty air rushed inside, carrying a metallic smell underneath the usual ocean scent. Not strong. Just enough that I checked the dashboard vents thinking something electrical overheated. Everything looked normal. The light ahead drifted slightly sideways, not floating like a balloon. Smooth, controlled. I remember gripping the wheel harder because something about the movement felt deliberate. Then my radio cut into static suddenly. I'd been listening to low music without really paying attention until the signal dissolved completely. The static wasn't normal either. It pulsed rhythmically, almost like distant voices buried underneath. I shut it off. The silence afterward felt enormous. The road kept winding through dunes. The glow remained ahead. Every time I rounded another bend, I expected finally to reach whatever was causing it. Instead, it seemed farther out again. I checked my phone at one point, thinking maybe I'd missed the beach turn somehow. No signal. Battery down to 9%, even though it had charged all night. Then the screen dimmed by itself and froze completely. I tossed it onto the passenger seat, irritated more than scared at that point. The real fear started maybe 20 minutes later, because I realized the road should have ended already. I'd driven that route before. The beach parking area wasn't far from the highway, but the dunes just kept stretching ahead endlessly under the pale sky. The glow stayed fixed above them, and still no sound from the ocean. Then something moved beside the road, fast enough that I only caught it briefly in the headlights. A tall shape crossing between dunes on the passenger side. Not an animal, too upright. I slammed the brakes instinctively. Sand sprayed under the tires as the car slowed hard. I looked back immediately. Nothing there except dune grass bending slightly. My headlights swept across pale sand and wooden fencing. Empty. The metallic smell inside the car had grown stronger, almost like wet steel. I sat there listening. No wind outside now either. The grass had stopped